Believe it or not, the concept of a proper exposure is actually somewhat subjective. Certainly there's a good exposure and a bad exposure, one that's too bright or too dark, for example, but there's a fair amount of latitude in between so that you can exercise some artistic judgment as you're interpreting a particular scene. So what exactly makes a proper exposure? The concept relates to gray. In essence, a proper exposure is one where something in the scene that is gray will actually appear as gray, not as a very bright shade of gray or a very dark shade of gray. For example, if you're photographing a relatively dark subject against a relatively bright background, for example, me set against this bright sky, you've got an exposure challenge. If you expose properly for me, so that I look properly exposed, the background, in this case the sky, is going to look very, very bright, possibly completely blown out, as you can see here. If, on the other hand, you were to expose for the sky, in other words, so that the sky looks perfect, then I'm going to be rendered far too dark, as you can see. I'm silhouetted, essentially, against that bright sky. And this represents one of the more challenging scenarios in terms of exposure. A very strong difference between certain areas and other areas in terms of brightness. A bright background with a dark foreground or vice versa. When you face these sorts of challenges, of course, you really need to understand exposure in order to produce the best result. In the case of a high contrast scene, that sometimes means making compromises. But the important thing is for you to understand the concepts related to exposure so that you'll know how to deal with challenging situations. And those are exactly the sorts of situations you're going to learn to deal with in this video course. If you've paid attention to any digital camera advertisements, you can certainly appreciate that certain cameras come with certain features, and usually the more expensive cameras come with the more advanced features. There's lots of differences between different cameras, and that relates to exposure in terms of how you can control the exposure. For example, in a more casual setting, when I might not have my real camera with me, I'll sometimes just use my camera phone in order to capture an image. Of course, this is a very basic camera, a very small lens, and not a lot of flexibility in terms of our exposure settings. In fact, in my case, I have absolutely no adjustments for exposure whatsoever. I simply point the camera at my scene and press the button to take a picture, literally just point and shoot. In other situations, I might use a more casual camera, something a little bit more advanced than a camera phone, but still relatively basic, your traditional point-and-shoot camera. Now in this case, I would use a camera like this for capturing more casual scenes. I very often use a point-and-shoot camera, for example, when I'm traveling and I'm just capturing the experiences that I've had. Not the images that I intend to later perhaps hang on the wall or share with family and friends, but those that document where I was, what I was eating, and perhaps photographing the signs and other elements that just document my progress on a vacation. Now in this case, of course, I have a little bit more control than a camera phone. I've got a lens that can actually be zoomed in and out so that I can adjust my framing of the subject, and I have some very basic adjustments for adjusting my exposure. I can brighten or darken the scene to some extent, and I can use special capture modes in order to compensate for the exposure environment. For example, high contrast scenes versus low contrast scenes. Still relatively limited, but obviously a bit more control than a camera phone. Of course, when I'm really interested in trying to capture the best image possible, then I'm going to use my digital SLR. Now, of course, a digital SLR has all sorts of different controls available. For starters, we're generally using a much larger lens than we would have with any point-and-shoot camera, and we often have great controls. For example, being able to adjust my zoom setting to frame the subject, and also being able to focus manually. And when it comes to exposure, I have tremendous control over the capture. I can use some of the relatively automatic modes, and in fact I even have a fully automatic mode for calculating exposure, but I can control the exposure in a completely manual way as well. So with this camera, I can deal with just about any photographic situation. High contrast, low light situations. I can do a good job as long as I understand how to adjust exposure properly. And that's the case with any digital camera. Whether it's your camera phone, a point-and-shoot camera, or an advanced digital SLR, it's important that you understand what options are available to you in terms of exposure and how to actually use those controls that are available in order to produce the best image possible. When a digital camera takes a picture, it saves a file. And that file can be in a variety of different file formats. Today's cameras primarily capture in RAW versus JPEG mode, and just about every digital SLR does indeed offer a RAW capture option. And some point-and-shoots also offer this option. So why would you choose one over the other? Well, first of all, every picture the camera takes is actually a RAW capture. It just might not be saved that way. The reason is that a RAW capture is simply a collection of the information gathered by the imaging sensor. So quite simply, the camera is gathering information, taking light and converting it into pixel values, and storing that information in a file. A RAW capture takes that original information, untouched by the camera, and saves it to a file so it can be processed later. With the JPEG image, the file is processed in the camera from that RAW capture and converted into a JPEG file. So, which file format should you choose? Well, you can certainly use JPEG. There's certainly a convenience factor with JPEG by virtue of being able to simply copy the file to your computer and put it to use immediately. With a RAW capture, there will be some post-processing necessary, but there are advantages to RAW capture, and it certainly relates to exposure. With a JPEG file, there are several limitations. One of those is that you're only going to have 8-bit per channel information. What that translates into is that if you need to apply significant adjustments, there is the potential to have posterization, the loss of smooth transition of tones and colors within the image. Also, JPEG files are always compressed, which can affect image quality to some extent. In most cases, that quality will be very good, but if you need to produce a very large print, then the JPEG artifacts might show up, and that can obviously be a big problem. With RAW capture, we have a significant benefit in being able to process the image after it was captured. Some of the settings are really not that critical. For example, the color temperature adjustment can be set after the capture. So it doesn't matter what the color temperature was set to, the white balance adjustment in the camera, because you can adjust after the fact in the RAW processing. However, we do get a benefit when it comes to exposure. Specifically, a RAW capture, because it contains all of the information that was gathered by the image sensor, is able to produce a wider dynamic range. What that means in terms of our dealing with exposure is that even if you've clipped a little bit of highlight detail based on what the camera is showing you, you can probably, or at least possibly, pull that information back in. If the image appears to be overexposed by maybe about 1/2 stop and sometimes as much as a stop, there's a very good possibility that in the RAW conversion you'll be able to recover that information. In other words, with a JPEG, the highlight detail would be lost, whereas with a RAW capture you can preserve that highlight detail. We'll also be able to get a broader dynamic range in the final image. In other words, more highlight detail and more shadow detail. And that can be a significant benefit, especially when the dynamic range of the scene is very high or when your exposure was just a little bit off. So I certainly recommend capturing in RAW mode. In fact, I always capture in RAW on my digital SLR. It helps to ensure that I have maximum flexibility and maximum quality in my final image. And when it relates to exposure, it helps me make up for slight miscalculations of my exposure or situations where the dynamic range of the scene presents a challenge for my camera. That RAW capture mode will help you optimize your exposures after you've taken the picture. The basic concept of exposure is reasonably straightforward. In essence, we're brightening or darkening the scene, or compensating for bright or dark lighting conditions. But our cameras actually contain two adjustments in order to adjust our exposure. We don't simply adjust brightness in the camera, but rather we adjust the aperture and the shutter speed. The aperture is the size of the hole that the light is passing through in the lens. Within a lens, here I have a manual lens that allows me to adjust the aperture manually. I can change the size of the hole that the light is passing through. With a relatively large hole, then I have a relatively large amount of light that's passing through the lens. With a relatively small hole, then I have a small amount of light passing through the lens. We measure the aperture based on the relationship between the size of the aperture and the focal length of a lens. So it's a fraction. f8 means that the aperture is 1/8 the size of the focal length of the lens. The diameter of the aperture is 1/8 the size of the focal length. Of course, this is going to vary from different lenses based on the focal length of that individual lens, but we're always talking about that relationship between the size of the aperture and the lens itself. With a larger aperture, we're letting in more light, so then we need to consider the shutter speed that we're using. With lots of light, we're going to expose the image for a shorter duration. With a smaller aperture, we're letting in less light, and so we need to keep the shutter open longer in order to capture enough light to produce a proper exposure. So for example, if I'm producing an exposure with a relatively small aperture, I'm going to have a long shutter speed. In this case, a half-second exposure. If, on the other hand, I'm using a relatively open aperture, then I'm going to use a shorter duration shutter speed. In this case, a 20th of a second, but it could be even faster depending on my lighting conditions. So there's a direct relationship between the aperture and the shutter speed. With more light coming in through the lens, we need to expose the image for a shorter duration of time. And with less light coming into the lens, we'll expose for a longer duration. So again, a relatively long exposure versus a relatively short exposure. The key thing to keep in mind is that there's a relationship between the aperture of the lens and the shutter speed you're using for the camera. So with a relatively large aperture, you'll use a relatively fast shutter speed, and with a relatively small aperture, you'll use a relatively slow shutter speed. Understanding that relationship and the interaction between aperture and shutter speed will enable you to better understand how to compensate for particular exposure situations, and more importantly, how to exercise creative control over your photographic images. We use the aperture setting for our lens to control a significant portion of the exposure and the overall composition, since it affects depth of field. And when it comes to aperture, each individual lens actually has its own limitations, and there's a variety of factors to take into account here. Number one is the range of apertures that a given lens is able to accommodate. In this particular case, for example, I'm using a lens that's maximum aperture, the largest size, is f4. And the minimum size is f22, but that is by no means a very large range. Some lenses will have apertures as large as an f1.8, others will have a diameter small enough to produce an f32, for example. The range of apertures available to you with a particular lens determines a variety of attributes and limitations related to a particular photographic scene. For example, that range determines the potential range of depth of field. If you're not able to produce a very wide aperture, you're not going to be able to produce an extremely narrow depth of field. And if you're not able to really stop the lens down enough, you might not be able to produce a large enough depth of field for certain situations. That all depends, of course, on what you're trying to accomplish with a given scene, but keep in mind, the lens does have certain limitations in that regard. There's also issues related to being able to focus. For example, the larger the aperture, the greater the lens's ability to focus because it's gathering more light. With more light, it can see the scene a little bit better, it can find contrast more readily, and it's able to focus easily and more quickly. So that's certainly a significant benefit. Of course, some of these attributes relate to the price of the lens, and a lens that's able to open a very large aperture is, generally speaking, going to be a more expensive lens. We also need to consider the potential shutter speed we're able to accomplish. The range of available apertures also determines the potential for shutter speeds, and in particular is an issue when we're using a camera handheld. If I'm able to capture on a tripod and my subject is static, then I don't necessarily need to worry too much about a long exposure. But in a situation where the subject is moving or where I'm not able to use a tripod for whatever reason, then I may have an issue with shutter speeds relative to my aperture potential. So here, for example, I might want to photograph these rocks. They're very, very dark. We don't have very much light. The rocks have some moss on them. They're pretty dark overall. And so if I were to try to capture an image here, even with my ISO set to 1600, which is the point where I start to worry a little bit about noise in my capture, and an aperture of f4, which is wide open for this particular lens, I'm still getting a shutter speed of about 1/20th of a second. There's no way I could hold that handheld and get a sharp image. So I'd either need to use a tripod or, ideally, be able to open up that aperture even more. But here I'm not able to. It's one of the limitations of this particular lens. And that's going to vary from lens to lens. So when it comes to the limitations of your lens, it's important to keep in mind what the potential is. It might affect your purchasing decision. It'll certainly affect your decision to choose a particular lens for a particular photographic situation. And it's a big factor when it comes to exposure. The key thing is to understand your equipment, understand its limitations and its potential, so you can use that equipment in order to produce the best photographic images. I was out enjoying the sunset, and now the sun has gone behind the mountains, the daylight is fading quickly, and I'm out here without my tripod. Now, I could go back to the car and get my tripod, but I've noticed now that I'm getting some really interesting light on the water, some nice reflections of the sky as the sun is setting. We get some very nice colors, and I'm concerned that by the time I get back from the car picking up my tripod, I will have lost my opportunity to capture the subject. And so I need to try and photograph handheld if at all possible. Now in this case, of course, the light is very low, and I suspect I will not be able to get a shutter speed that will be adequate handheld to produce a sharp photo. Let's take a look. I'm operating at 100 ISO and an aperture of f5.6, and if I capture an image here, wow, 1/10 of a second. Even if I try to hold very, very steady, there's just no way that I would be able to capture a sharp image at 1/10 of a second. There's going to be some movement of the camera that will cause blurring of the scene. But I do have another option available to me. I can increase the ISO setting for my camera. That will allow me to amplify the signal so that I can get a faster shutter speed. So I'll go ahead and make the adjustment here. I'll choose my ISO option, and then I can dial in a different ISO, for example, going up to 200, 400, 800, or in this case, I think I'm going to have to go all the way up to 1600 ISO. Now, this will give me an amplification of the signal that's being captured by the imaging sensor. It's not, in fact, adjusting the sensitivity of the sensor, it's rather amplifying the signal, which will lead to noise, unfortunately. Now, today's digital cameras do a great job of reducing noise, and there, of course, are other products I could use in post-processing, but I want to try to minimize any noise in my original capture. So I only want to increase the ISO if I absolutely have to, and even then, I only want to increase it by the amount that's absolutely necessary. In this case, 1600 is really pushing it, but I think I'm going to need it. And sure enough, at a 1600 ISO, I'm able to get a shutter speed of 1/125th of a second, which is about the minimum I would be comfortable using with this lens. This is a 105mm lens, and so I'd want at least about 100th of a second, so rounding up to 1/125th of a second shutter speed, in order to produce a sharp image handheld. So by increasing my ISO setting, I'm able to get a good shutter speed, a fast enough shutter speed, even under low lighting conditions, but I do need to keep in mind that that may increase the level of noise to potentially unacceptable levels in the capture. So I want to use that only when absolutely necessary. Dynamic range is an issue you'll confront on a regular basis as a photographer. So what exactly is dynamic range? Put simply, dynamic range is the difference between the brightest area of a scene and the darkest area of a scene. It represents a range of light values, the brightest white to the darkest black. In many cases, in a high contrast scene, for example, we can have a high dynamic range where we have bright whites and dark blacks. In the case of a low dynamic range, that means the tonal range is very narrow. We don't have extremely bright whites and we don't have extremely dark blacks. We have just tonal values in between, middle gray you might think of. And we can see that all around us. Here, for example, I have a scene that will show me both high dynamic range and low dynamic range. I have a variety of areas here where the sun is hitting the snow or is not hitting the snow, and that's going to give us some variation. Where the sun hits the snow, of course, we'll have very bright highlights. I also have dark leaves in the foreground, and those are going to absorb the light. And so here we have dark shadows, relatively speaking, and bright highlights. And of course, this is not even the most extreme situation you might come up against. If we had a bright sky or a sun going down behind a mountain, the foreground of the mountain is going to be backlit. That's very, very dark, and the sky will be very bright. So we can have some very extreme situations that we might have to deal with in photography. And of course, in some situations, we'll also have very low dynamic range. The leaves here in the foreground, for example, you can see that the leaves are all of a very similar color and tonal value. The brightest area of the leaves is not all that much brighter than the darkest area of the leaves. So with soft lighting, relatively even lighting, we get a low dynamic range. So in different circumstances, you'll see different ranges of dynamic range, whether it's a high dynamic range where we have high contrast or a relatively low dynamic range where we have low contrast. In either situation, you'll need to recognize the dynamic range in the scene before you and understand the limitations of your camera and how you can compensate for those limitations and for the scene before you in order to produce the best exposure every time. When adjusting the exposure of a photograph, you have two basic controls at your disposal. That's the aperture and the shutter speed. The aperture, of course, is the size of the hole in the lens that we're allowing light to pass through, and the shutter speed is how long we're exposing the scene in the camera. the aperture affects depth of field, and that's one of the greatest creative elements that we can use in a photograph. When we're composing the scene, we can think about the depth, how far away the foreground and background subjects are, and whether or not we want all of that or only some of that area to be in focus. I can adjust depth of field by adjusting my aperture setting on the camera. In this case, I'm already set to an aperture of f/22. That's a very small aperture, and that's going to give me a relatively large depth of field. It doesn't mean I'll necessarily be able to get everything in focus, but it does mean I'll get more in focus than I otherwise would have with a larger aperture. I'm going to take a look at my setup here. Composition looks pretty good, but I'm going to use my depth of field preview so that I can see through the viewfinder an estimation of what that final depth of field will do. By pressing my depth of field preview button, I'm actually stopping down the aperture. I'm closing that aperture down so that the lens is showing me what the scene will actually look like in terms of depth of field. The problem is that that also darkens up the scene in the viewfinder rather significantly, so I'm going to use my live view display, which enables me to get an exposure simulation of the final effect. And I'll go ahead and hold my depth of field preview button there, and I can see that I've got lots of depth of field. The background rock is not entirely in focus, but it's still relatively in focus, and that texture is actually distracting from my foreground rock, which is sort of my primary composition here. So I'm going to open up my aperture just a little bit. I'll hold my depth of preview button here as I continue adjusting. And if I were to go wide open, then I certainly get the background blurred now because I'm creating a very narrow depth of field. My concern, though, is that some of the rock structure in the foreground might be rendered a little bit out of focus. So based on the preview here, I think I'm going to go to f5.6. And that will give me a narrow depth of field where my foreground rock is in focus, but the background rock is not in focus. And of course, with the live view, I'm getting a much better sense of the actual final effect, including utilizing the depth of field preview. So that's looking pretty good. I'll go ahead and make my exposure. Now, of course, here I've got relatively low light. I want to use a very low ISO setting to minimize the risk of noise. So I'm ending up with a 1/4 of a second exposure. I'm using a tripod, but still I'm a little bit concerned about camera vibration. So I'm going to use a timer mode to capture the actual exposure. Go ahead and set that, take the exposure, and it's triggered there. It's just a 2-second timer, and I've got my final image. So again, by evaluating the scene and making a decision about depth of field and how much I want to have in focus in my final composition, I can adjust my aperture in order to achieve that desired result. Photographers often talk about stops, but I wonder just how many photographers actually understand the concept. Well, stops relate to a measurement of light. When we talk about stops, we're talking about how much light we're recording with our cameras. And it relates to the amount of light in the scene, of course. So, for example, let's take a look at this scene here. We have some dark trees in the background going up the hillside, and we also have a relatively bright road. It's actually gray asphalt, but with the sunlight, it's actually coming out fairly bright. It would almost appear white in certain photos, depending on our exposure. And so, in some ways, we have a little bit of a tricky exposure situation. Some dark trees and a relatively bright road passing through the scene. So we can think about the concept of stops in determining how we would expose this scene and thinking about how much light we would be recording. For example, if we wanted to increase the amount of light so that we can see more detail in the trees, we could increase, for example, by 1 stop. Well, 1 stop, increasing the exposure, is doubling the amount of light that we're recording. So in this case, that would brighten up the trees significantly, and we'd be able to see much more detail there. The problem is, with the road, that might cause it to get blown out. We might lose detail in the highlights within the road. Conversely, we could reduce the amount of light we're recording. If we reduce our exposure by 1 stop, we're cutting the amount of light that we're recording in half. Now, in that case, we would certainly retain detail in the road, but we might start to lose detail in those darker trees. We're reducing the amount of light, no longer seeing as much light in those trees, and the detail might be lost. Let's take a look at how that might look as we're actually capturing an image with the camera. I can go ahead and frame up my subject here. And if I take a capture at just a normal exposure, what the camera meters it at, you'll see that we have a relatively normal scene here. But if I also want to adjust my exposure, I can think about the concept of stops. So increasing my exposure by 1 stop will cause the scene to be rendered brighter. I'm doubling the amount of light that I'm actually recording. And of course I could take that further. I'll increase by 2 stops of exposure or 3 stops of exposure, and each time I'm doubling the amount of light I'm recording. And obviously for this scene, I'm not going to get very much detail if I overexpose by 3 stops. Everything will be rendered very, very brightly. If I were to reduce my exposure to underexpose the scene, for example, if I reduce by 1 stop, then I'm cutting the amount of light based on a normal exposure in half. And that, of course, causes a very dark scene, or a relatively dark scene. If I take that down further, I'll go down to 2 stops of underexposure. The scene becomes even darker. It almost looks like a nighttime scene now. And if I take it down to 3 stops underexposed, then the scene looks almost entirely black, because I'm adjusting the amount of light that I'm recording. Now, more often than not, a proper exposure means that we're metering relatively at the middle, at a proper exposure. And if we increase or decrease the amount of light, obviously that can have a significant impact on the image. But by understanding the concept of stops, that we're either doubling or cutting in half the amount of light for each stop that we increase or decrease our exposure, we'll be better able to both communicate about an exposure and actually understand how we might adjust that exposure. In many cases, we're depending upon our camera to measure information about the light in the scene we're going to photograph. It's metering that light and trying to give us a good indication of what our exposure should be. And I think in many cases, photographers aren't even aware that the exposure meter is actually displayed for all exposure modes. Even if you're using an automatic exposure mode, you will typically see the exposure meter so that you know what the metering is. Of course, for an automatic exposure mode, because the camera is making adjustments to either the aperture or shutter speed, or in some cases both, the meter will always be centered unless we apply an exposure compensation. But we can also use that meter in other modes, for example in the manual mode, so that we can adjust our exposure based on what the meter is telling us. The thing we need to keep in mind is that the meter is assuming a value of middle gray in terms of luminance. And so we need to possibly compensate depending on the scene. Now in this case, I have this wonderful old ladder against an old wood building, really nice textures and tones. And so I'd like to photograph this subject. I've got myself framed up here and focused on the ladder, and I want to capture a relatively deep depth of field so that all of the texture, both in the ladder and the building, is rendered in sharp focus. So in this case, I'm set at an aperture of f5.6 and a shutter speed of 1/60th of a second at ISO 100. And when I press my shutter release halfway to get a meter indication, I see that with those settings, I can expect an exposure that is 1/2 stop overexposed. Of course, that all depends on the subject, the scene, but I'm going to make an adjustment here to my settings. I want more depth of field, and so I'm going to adjust my aperture to f16. And when I check the meter reading now, I see the needle has swung far to the left, very much underexposed, and that's because I've closed down the aperture. I'm getting less light, so I'll need to increase the exposure duration. I'll need to adjust my shutter speed, and so we'll increase that shutter speed. And it looks like then we can use a shutter speed of 1/10 of a second to center the meter. So centering that meter's needle with f16 and 1/10 of a second. Presumably, at least based on the camera's metering, that means I'll produce a good exposure. So let's go ahead and capture a frame here, and we can take a look at the results we're getting. It looks good. In this case, the dynamic range is not very great. The ladder is relatively bright compared to the background, but not so bright that it's causing an extreme exposure situation. But still, it looks like I could get a better exposure. I'd prefer to have the scene as bright as possible. I'd like to adjust my settings so that I'll end up with a 1/2 stop of overexposure according to the meter. I believe in this case that's actually going to produce an optimal exposure for me, but the meter thinks that's too bright. Let's take a look. So in this case, we'll go ahead and keep the aperture at f16. This puts us at 1/8 of a second rather than 1/10 of a second. And I'll capture a frame there. And that looks much, much better. My histogram is shifted over to the right nearly to the end, but I've not lost any highlight detail. So I've maximized the amount of information, minimized the noise, and most importantly, I've used that meter as a tool. to give me an indication of what the camera thinks the exposure is going to look like, and then adjusting, applying some level of compensation. There's a variety of ways I could do that. In this case, just working in the manual exposure mode, adjusting so that I can evaluate and change my settings to produce the best result based on my experience with exposure. And as you get more knowledgeable about exposure, you'll be able to anticipate those needs without even needing to review the initial result on your camera's LCD display. You'll be able to see the scene and say, nah, well, there's a bright area. I don't have too much dynamic range. I'd like to brighten things up just a little bit. So based on the metering, I'll go up half a stop or maybe even a full stop in certain situations. But again, just by understanding exposure a little better, you'll be able to anticipate those adjustments. One of the tools available to you in terms of evaluating and even adjusting your exposure is the histogram. The histogram display, quite simply, is an indication of the distribution of tonal values within your image. We can use that histogram in the camera to help us evaluate an exposure and make adjustments to that exposure accordingly. Of course, one of the first things you need to keep in mind when it comes to evaluating a histogram in the camera, if you're capturing RAW, is that the histogram doesn't truly reflect the RAW capture. Rather, the histogram is generated based on the camera's interpretation of your RAW capture. What that really means is that the histogram is as though you were capturing a JPEG image in the camera. That doesn't mean you can't trust the histogram at all. It just means that you actually have a little bit more latitude in adjusting the RAW capture, and so you don't need to worry about the precise positioning of that histogram. As long as it's very close to where you want it, you'll be in good shape. So let's take a look at what a histogram actually looks like. I've got a scene framed up here, and I'm going to take a photograph of these leaves. And based on the previous settings that I had been using, I'm actually ending up with an image that is underexposed. So I can take a look at the histogram on the back of the camera, and I'll see that the histogram display is shifted over to the left. Now, most cameras have the option of displaying both an individual color channel histogram as well as a luminance histogram. And what that means is we can see the red, green, and blue channels individually, each has their own histogram, or we can see an overall luminosity histogram, in other words, based on tonal values, ignoring color. And in some cases, you can also see a color overlay histogram that displays all of those colors one on top of the other. So here I can evaluate my multiple histograms. I've got red, green, and blue, as well as my luminance histogram. And because of the camera settings, I see that the image is actually a little bit underexposed. I might even be losing just a little bit of shadow detail. So I'm going to make an adjustment. I'll adjust my exposure here, and we'll take another image. And I'll take a look at the histogram for this particular image, and that's looking much, much better. Now I have a good distribution. Well, what does that good distribution mean? Really, what I'm looking for is avoiding clipping in my histogram. If I have values that are clipped to the left, meaning my shadow detail has been lost, then the histogram display will run off the left edge of that histogram. If the histogram is clipping over on the right side, that means our highlight detail has been lost, and that's indicated by, again, that histogram running off the display over on the right-hand side. In low light situations or relatively low contrast situations, you're not likely to see a histogram spread all the way across the display. But in a high contrast scene, it becomes very, very important. We want to make sure especially that we're not losing any highlight detail. If anything, we would usually sacrifice shadow detail rather than risking the loss of highlight detail in our images. And by just evaluating the histogram on the back of the camera's display, we can get a good sense of the accuracy, the relative quality of the exposure, and then make adjustments to our settings based on that. Of course, that assumes that we're able to actually reproduce the image very easily. In many situations, you may have a scene, a subject matter that's going to get away from you if you don't have your best exposure settings right from the start. So this doesn't replace a true understanding of exposure, but it can help you evaluate and adjust exposures in a variety of situations. We can use a histogram display to evaluate our exposure, and one of the key considerations there is where we're placing the actual tonal values in our image relative to the histogram. In other words, is the exposure relatively dark or relatively bright? Capturing a digital photograph is all about recording information, and the more information we have, the less noise we have, and the more detail we'll have. It's important, therefore, to have as much information as possible. And what that means is exposing as bright as possible without losing any highlight detail. Now, that does mean you're probably going to need to apply some adjustments after the capture, but it also means you're going to end up with the best quality possible. That's not necessarily what you would consider a perfect exposure, photographically speaking, but in terms of the quality of the information you're gathering, it is ideal. Let's take a look. I've found this leaf set against the mosses here on the rock. I'm going to go ahead and capture a frame here, and I'll take a look at the histogram on the back of the camera, and I can see here that the histogram display is shifted far over to the left, which indicates that this is a relatively dark exposure. Now, in a high contrast scene, I might not have very much latitude. I might not be able to shift my exposure darker or brighter in order to reposition that histogram. If the histogram extends the full width, that means the dynamic range is taking up the full tonal range that the camera is able to record. In this case, though, I do have some room, and so I'd like to shift that histogram over to the right in order to maximize the amount of information I'm recording and minimize the noise. That also means brightening up the image, of course. So I'll go ahead and adjust my exposure, and let's take a look at how this ends up. That's looking much, much better. My histogram is now shifted over toward the right, which indicates that I'm indeed capturing as much information as possible. But taking a close look here, I see that I'm actually losing a little bit of information. Now, this is not luminance information that's been lost per se. I'm actually only clipping the red channel. That isn't a major problem, but it does mean that I've taken the exposure just a little bit too far, and I'm potentially losing some information within the scene. So I'll adjust my exposure just a slight amount, and let's take another capture with those revised settings. Again, trying to get that histogram pushed as far over to the right without actually losing information, and that's looking to be a really good compromise. So now I have a good histogram shifted over to the right, maximizing the amount of information that I'm recording, minimizing the amount of noise, and ensuring that I'm going to have the most detail, the best quality image possible. Photography, of course, has everything to do with light, and light has a color element to it in addition to a luminance element. And of course, we need to compensate for the color of the light when we're capturing an image. So I have a scene here. I'm in a kitchen with some mixed lighting, and I've got some fruit that I'm going to photograph. Not because I especially care to photograph fruit, but because fruit actually provides a really good basis for us to evaluate color. And that's because many fruits represent memory colors for us. Objects that we are very familiar with, and so we can recognize the appropriate color. For example, you know the difference between the yellow of a banana and the yellow of a lemon. So I have a setup here with some bananas and apples, some oranges, and I'm going to photograph this scene in an effort to evaluate the color of light and how I can compensate for the color of light. So let's take a look here. I'm using the auto white balance setting initially, and I should note that if you're capturing in RAW, in most cases it's actually perfectly fine to use the auto white balance setting in your camera. It's not critical to compensate in the camera because we can equally adjust after the fact in the RAW conversion process. But always good to have the image right out of the camera as accurate as possible, so not a bad idea to adjust your white balance settings in the camera. I'll go ahead and establish my white balance setting. I'll turn on my white balance adjustment here. I'm using the live view just to make it a little bit easier to go through my settings, and I can take a look at the various presets that I have available to me and look at how they affect the color of the fruit as I'm trying to photograph it. So we can take a look at daylight, for example, and daylight's obviously a very warm light, and so to neutralize that color cast we would need to cool down the image. In this case, however, I'm actually using some very warm lights that are warmer than daylight, and so even though that is cooling down the image based on daylight conditions, I'm still ending up with a relatively warm scene. Switching to shade, I can see that the image is being warmed up significantly because shade, of course, is a relatively cool light. In the shade, you'll see mostly blues and cyans, and so we can see a compensation here where the image is getting more yellow and a little bit of orange to it. I can then shift to cloudy, and similarly, cloudy is a relatively cool light source, so the image is being warmed up a little bit. Taking a look at the tungsten option, which relates to incandescent lighting, of course, tungsten light is a very, very warm source of light, warmer than the lights I'm using here, and so now we see that the image gets considerably cooler. I'll then switch to the fluorescent mode, and of course fluorescent lighting tends to be quite green, and so we'll notice that as we're compensating for that green light, we're getting a little bit of magenta in the colors, especially in the shadows. With flash, a relatively neutral color source, we can see that we're just causing the image to be a little bit warm. Not a perfect compensation in this case, but we can see the change in colors. And then we also have a couple of custom modes in this particular case, and I have both a custom setting as well as an option where I can adjust the color temperature directly. I'm going to start with the color temperature adjustment, and as I dial in, I can take a look and see what the image looks like on my live view and see that it's a little bit warm. I'm going to go ahead and turn down that color temperature a little bit and see if we can produce a more neutral result. And we'll cool that down just a little bit more. If I go too far, of course, the shadows in particular are going to look very, very cool, and the colors in the fruit are going to start looking not very natural. So I'll try and find a setting that works well, and we're up at, around 3300. Well, what exactly is 3300 in this context? Well, that's degrees Kelvin. So when we talk about the color of light, it's a color temperature, and that color temperature is expressed on a Kelvin scale. And in this case, I'm actually able to select a specific color of Kelvin. That Kelvin temperature relates to the color of the light that I'm trying to compensate for. And on that scale, a lower temperature is what we would think of as a warmer light source, yellow to orange, for example. Whereas a higher temperature is what we would think of as a cooler light source, something that's relatively blue, for example. So it's a little bit backwards based on what we think of in terms of warm and cool colors. Now we also have a custom white balance setting, and with a custom white balance setting, I'm actually able to measure the specific color of the light. So I have a white card here that I can use in order to capture the color of the light all by itself. I'll go into the menu on my camera here and choose custom white balance, and I can then take a picture, go ahead and put the image in front of the frame. I want to make sure that this white card is under the same lighting that's illuminating my subject here, so it's illuminating the fruit. I'll capture that image, and then on the menu I can choose that image as the basis of my color temperature adjustment. When I do so, I'll go back to my live view of the image, and we can see that we've applied a good compensation. And in most cases, that custom white balance setting is going to give you the most accurate results because you're actually measuring the color of light that's striking your subject and compensating for that specific color. So at this point, I have what looks to be a very good compensation for the color temperature of this scene. But what happens if I'm under different lighting circumstances? Well, I can turn on a blue light source here, and we'll see that the image gets cast into a relatively blue light. We go from a neutral scene on my camera to something that looks very, very blue. We'll notice that some of the colors, for example, the apple, the reds start to look a little bit too purplish, and the yellow starts to look a little bit blue in the banana, and the shadows definitely look very blue to cyan. And that indicates, of course, that my current color temperature adjustment is not accurate based on the color of light that's illuminating the scene. So I'll go ahead back into my white balance adjustment here, and now I'll dial in a custom white balance. I'll go ahead and choose a particular color temperature, and it looks like right around 4,000 degrees Kelvin, give or take, is going to give me a very good result. So regardless of the color of light, I'm able to compensate for that color of light right in my camera. And again, you can compensate after the fact when you're working in raw capture mode, but it's always a good idea to have every image that comes out of the camera be as accurate as possible. And color temperature, of course, relates to some extent to our overall exposure, and it's certainly part of compensating for exposure situations as well. So understanding that color temperature is certainly a big part of understanding proper exposure. As you're just getting started with exposure, you might feel that you'd like to let the camera do all of the work for you, not just most of the work for you. And there are a couple of exposure modes that will actually enable you to do that. The first would be the green mode, and this is a full automatic mode. It essentially changes my digital SLR into a point and shoot camera, and I mean literally point and shoot. I can't adjust anything. The camera is going to make all of the decisions for me. So let's take a look. I can simply frame up my scene, and I go to take a picture. And actually you see that it has caused the flash to pop up, because even though this mountain is very far away from me, the camera thinks that because it's a relatively low light scene that I need fill flash. That's a little bit silly in this case. I would still end up with a good exposure because it's going to use a relatively fast shutter speed, but obviously I'm not able to control the situation very much. I can take things a step further and use my program mode. So if I switch to program mode, I have a little bit more control. It's still a very automatic mode, but I can make some adjustments. For example, in my case, and this will vary from some cameras, I can adjust my ISO setting and I can also adjust my aperture. However, that aperture is not going to be set in stone. It's just a guide for the camera. I'm essentially telling the camera whether I want a relatively narrow depth of field or a relatively deep depth of field. So I can adjust, in this case, for example, maybe I'll choose to go with f8 and I'll frame up my scene and take my picture. And even though I asked the camera to use f8, it actually adjusted the exposure and used f9.5. So it's staying close to the value that I established, but it's taking some control over the process. So under situations where you want to exercise very little control or perhaps no control at all, you just want the camera to do the work for you, you can use your green mode, your full automatic mode, or program mode to produce a good exposure under most circumstances. When your primary consideration for an exposure is the shutter speed, then you might want to use the shutter priority mode. This allows us to determine which shutter speed we'll be using for a particular exposure and maintain that shutter speed while adjusting the aperture automatically in order to render a proper exposure. Of course, this shutter priority mode is actually usually not called shutter priority mode on the camera itself. Instead, it's usually referred to as time value mode, because it's prioritizing the shutter speed's time. Let's take a look at the possibility here with the subject, a waterfall here that I'd like to photograph, and I'd like to render it with a relatively slow shutter speed. Go ahead and capture an image here, and I can see I've got a 1/30th of a second shutter speed. That's reasonably slow, but I'd like to get a very slow shutter speed. I want this water to really be blurred so we have a very dramatic and sort of ethereal image. So I'd like to have, well, with water moving relatively quickly, maybe about a half-second exposure. So I'll go ahead and set my camera to the time value mode, that shutter priority mode, and I'm going to dial in a setting of 1/2 of a second. And for this particular scene, that's going to adjust the aperture to f16, relatively stopped down for this particular lens. So I'll go ahead and capture an image here. And there we go. We've got a half-second exposure. We've got a great blur of the water. It looks very ethereal. The water is just this white blur going through the frame. But because I'm using this time value or shutter priority mode, I can move about and recompose as I see fit and still know that I'm going to maintain that half-second exposure in this particular case. I'll maintain my shutter speed regardless of the particular scene. So up above, you can see that the water is relatively bright, and so the exposure is going to be a little bit different up there. I need to stop down the lens a little bit in order to produce an accurate exposure in that area. Down below, things are a little bit darker, and so to use the same shutter speed, I would need to open up the aperture a bit in order to allow more light. And so we'll go ahead and recompose, and I'll go down into a darker area of the scene here. And now I'll go ahead and capture an image, and I'm still producing a 1/2 second exposure, but my aperture has been adjusted. So I still get the blur of that water, that ethereal look, but I'm able to adjust my aperture automatically in the camera. So I think about what I want in terms of the shutter speed, and the camera is going to do the rest of the work for me, regardless of the lighting conditions. Now, one of the things you need to really keep in mind when using shutter priority mode is that you don't have a full range of options available to you. For example, here I'm operating under some relatively low lighting conditions. I'm in the shade, it's an overcast day, and I'm trying to photograph this waterfall in this low light. I can't get an extremely fast shutter speed. So even using shutter priority mode, I can't establish, for example, a 1/4000th of a second shutter speed and expect my camera to produce an accurate exposure. So I still need to pay attention and make sure I'm able to accomplish the desired result, that I'm still within the limitations of a proper exposure, both by looking at the metering or by the message from the camera indicating that I'm out of range. So I'll set an appropriate shutter speed for the conditions, and the camera can adjust the aperture within reason in order to produce an accurate exposure. I tend not to use shutter priority mode all that often because in most cases I'm more interested in adjusting my depth of field. That said, in certain situations, using shutter priority can help ensure that you're getting the best results for a given situation. You're able to accomplish what it is you're after in a photograph when shutter speed is the most important factor. As a photographer, you have many decisions to make as you're composing a photographic scene. That includes, of course, the basic composition. Where are you standing? How are you positioning the camera? What lens are you using? As well as a variety of factors that relate to exposure. And one of the key things that you can adjust in terms of that exposure is the depth of field. And that's controlled by the aperture of the lens. We can use a very large depth of field to include a wide range of subject matter in focus, or a very narrow depth of field to emphasize a particular subject, for example. Now, I found this wood pile, and I absolutely love the colors and textures that are found here. I've got a lot of yellows and oranges, even some reds and browns, and a variety of different shapes as well. I've got half circles and quarter circles and wedges, a variety of different textures, tones, colors, and I find it really interesting. I'd like to photograph this subject. Now, I could step back and photograph it head on. I'll have everything essentially in one plane so that everything appears in focus, and I don't have to make a decision about depth of field. But I think that's a little less interesting. I'd like to show the depth. This is quite a wide length of wood here, and I'd like to show some sense of that depth, and I can do that through depth of field. So I've positioned my camera here. I'm going to shoot along the length of the pile of wood here, focusing on this particular board. I've chosen this one because it's sticking out a little bit, and it's just an interesting foreground subject that I can use in my composition. So let's take a look at the camera here. I'll get framed up and set my focus on that board, and now I need to make a decision about depth of field. How much of this wood do I want to include in sharp focus within the depth of field? I could start off by having everything in focus, and this is a tendency many photographers have. So for example, I'm capturing at f/22. That will give me a very deep depth of field, and I can capture the image and review it and take a look, and sure enough, just about everything is within the depth of field. So I've got lots of wood in focus here. In this case, though, I want to emphasize how far back the wood pile really goes. And while you might think that that would call for a broader depth of field, more depth of field, so that everything's in focus, I can actually accentuate that depth by narrowing my depth of field and focusing on a foreground subject. So again, focusing on this particular block of wood, I can open up the aperture a little bit. I'll go down to f8 in this case, and I'll get set up here and capture another frame, again using f8. This will give me a narrower depth of field, so just a few of the blocks of wood here are going to be in focus. But of course I can take this even further. In this case, my widest aperture is f4. So I'll open up the aperture all the way to f4 and capture the same subject once again, and now I have a very narrow depth of field. So just this one block of wood is going to be in focus, and that focus tapers off until most of the wood is actually completely out of focus. So I've used a narrow depth of field in order to adjust my composition. Now, I can always adjust as I see fit. For different subjects, I'm going to make different decisions. But the key is that by using aperture priority mode, I'm able to change my aperture, and the camera will do all the work of adjusting my shutter speed automatically. In some cases, the situation may be more complicated. For example, here, I have an overcast sky, the light is very soft, there's not much contrast, and so the exposure is relatively straightforward. However, if it were a more difficult exposure, I might need to make additional adjustments. But by using the aperture priority mode on my camera, I can adjust my aperture, and the camera will adjust the shutter speed to produce a good exposure of the scene automatically. I'm making the artistic decision about depth of field, and the camera is doing most of the other work for me. There's no question that the subject of exposure is a tricky subject, one that a lot of photographers tend to struggle with in terms of understanding for producing the best results for a given scene. There are a variety of rules that have been established to help photographers better understand exposure, and more importantly, to accomplish a better exposure in a relatively easy way. One of the more valuable such rules is the Sunny 16 rule. The concept is, if you use an aperture of f/16 on a sunny day, then you can use a shutter speed that matches your ISO. In essence, the reciprocal of the shutter speed will match your ISO. So when I'm shooting at an ISO setting of 100, using f/16, I would use a shutter speed of about 1/100th of a second. In this case, for my camera, that would be 1/125th of a second. And at ISO 200, I would then use a shutter speed of around 1/200th of a second, which again, in my case, would be 1/250th of a second. And so I can estimate my exposure settings based on this very simple rule. Of course, In this case today, I've got a very sunny scene, or relatively sunny scene, and a fair amount of clouds off in the distance, but here where the sun is, I actually have a fairly overcast sky. It's sort of a thin overcast. It's been varying a little bit today between thin and thick overcast in terms of where the sun's actually positioned. Now, one of the key things to keep in mind for the Sunny 16 rule is that it relates to incident light. In other words, the light that is all around me, not the light that's necessarily reflected from the scene. And this is one of the things that's great about the Sunny 16 rule. It's actually allowing me to deal with light itself, not worrying so much about the light being reflected from the scene. So let's take a look with this scene how I might utilize the Sunny 16 rule. Once again, I've got a bit of an overcast sky. Now, taking a look at my exposure settings here, if I were to trust the camera's meter entirely at 1/125th of a second, which theoretically means I'm operating at f16 because of a sunny sky, not the case here, but that's the concept, the camera actually thinks I should be shooting at f5.6. That, in this case, would actually render a sky that is completely blown out. The meter is being fooled by all the dark foreground here, and that's going to cause a problem with my exposure. But I can use a variation on Sunny 16. In this case, if I've got a thin overcast, then I could use f11, or with overcast skies, I can use what I refer to as the overcast 8 setting, using an f-stop of f8, and let's dial this down. And at around f8, now I'm going to get a much better exposure. And of course, if I were concerned about the particular settings, in this case, if I felt that the sun was a little bit more strong than an overcast sky would suggest, a thin overcast, then I can use f11 instead. So there we go. We've got a great exposure utilizing this Sunny 16 rule. Like any rule in photography, the Sunny 16 rule can be broken with impunity. Remember, this is art after all, and you can behave as an artist and break all of these rules. But this is a valuable rule. Using the Sunny 16 rule will help you better understand a potentially good exposure, at least getting started. And of course, as you become more and more familiar with exposure settings, you'll be able to compensate and adjust that rule using it as a basic guide so that you know roughly what sort of exposure setting you're going to need, but then adjusting those settings to suit your own needs as a photographer. We can use the meter in our camera to measure the light for a scene we're going to photograph, but in some situations you might not be sure how to approach that, which metering setting to use, and where exactly in the scene you want to meter. For example, here I have a wood railing that I'd like to photograph. It's illuminated by the sun, but behind it is some dark water, and so I might be concerned about how exactly to go about producing the best exposure. The camera's meter can certainly give me some assistance, but I can also get the help of a gray card. A gray card is 18% gray. Now that might confuse some photographers who have been working mostly digitally because they hear everything is 50% gray. Well, actually, 18% gray and 50% gray are exactly the same thing. How can that be? Well, 18% gray for a gray card is referring to how much light is reflected off of that card. So 18% gray is reflecting 18% of the light that strikes it. 50% gray is a measure of emitted light. It's halfway between black and white. They're both exactly the same shade of gray, and they're the basis of exposure. So let's take a look at how we can use the gray card to adjust our exposure. I'll get set up here. I'm going to use the manual mode just so that I can control the exposure a little bit more readily. And I'll frame up my subject, and I'm going to use an aperture of f8 in this case. I think that'll give me an adequate depth of field without having too much detail in the background. And then I can hold my gray card up to the available light. Now I'm using this to measure the light, so I want to make sure that it's in the same light as my subject. Here it's sunlight, so this is reasonably easy. I'll go ahead and meter off of this, and I can see at f8 I need to adjust my shutter speed, so I'm going to go with a faster shutter speed in this case. Looks like about 1/1000th of a second will give me a good result. Now, one of the things to keep in mind with the gray card is that the camera is actually configured to meter based on 12 to 14% of the reflected light in most cases. The gray card, of course, is 18%, so we're going to need to overexpose by about a half of a stop, at least in reference to the metering from the gray card. So I've set up for half stop overexposure, and I can take the picture, and I've got a great result. So because I'm using the gray card to measure the available light, I don't need to concern myself with the bright or dark areas of the subject that I'm going to photograph. All I need to do is measure the actual light and adjust my camera in order to produce a good exposure based on that light. At the end of the day, as the daylight starts to fade, the light levels obviously get lower and lower. And if you're shooting handheld, that can present a problem in terms of shutter speed. In particular, a shutter speed that's too slow is going to cause the image to most likely be blurry. Let's take a look at what I can do here. The light levels are very, very low. And so actually, as my camera's configured now, I'm getting a 1/6 of a second exposure, and that's going to result in a blurry shot. As steady as I might be able to hold the camera, at 1/6 of a second, there's no way I'll be able to get a sharp photo. I would either need to use a tripod or make sure that I'm using a faster shutter speed. The general rule of thumb is that your focal length determines the minimum shutter speed that you want to try to utilize. In this case, for example, I'm utilizing a 105mm lens. I can use that as the reciprocal of my shutter speed, and that would be the minimum value that I would want to use. So in this case, 1/100th of a second, or for my camera, that would translate into a 1/125th of a second shutter speed. So I want to make sure that I'm at least at that fast a shutter if I'm going to shoot handheld. That might mean that I need to open up my aperture a bit more. I might need to adjust my ISO setting, increasing it so that I can get a faster shutter speed under the current circumstances, or I might need to get my tripod out of the car and take a picture mounted on the tripod. Obviously, we want to achieve a proper exposure for any image, but sometimes we might get so caught up thinking about proper exposure, or perhaps not thinking at all about it, that we don't consider the specific aperture and shutter speed that we're using to capture the image. In this case, I'm walking on a street here. We've got an overcast sky that's going to ensure some nice soft light. I don't have to worry about dynamic range at all, and some beautiful buildings in the background. But more importantly, there's trolleys that come up and down the street here, and that gives me the opportunity to photograph a moving subject, a dynamic subject, and it really gives me a chance to think about the specific shutter speed, in this case, that I'm going to use. In other words, do I want to use a shutter speed that will render the image perfectly sharp even though it's moving, or a relatively slow shutter speed so that we'll get some motion blur? First, I'm going to try getting a great motion blur shot, and to accomplish that, I'll pan with the subject. Now, I'm going to use an aperture priority mode and just set an aperture that will give me a good range of shutter speeds under the circumstances here. I don't need much in the way of depth of field, so I'll set the aperture to f5.6, and I'm also going to set my ISO to 200, and in this particular lighting, that's going to give me a shutter speed that averages right around 1/10 of a second, and that will turn out to be very good in most cases for subjects moving at this speed when I'm panning with the subject. Now, one of the most important things is to actually pan with the subject so that my camera speed is matching the speed of the subject. I'll pan right with the trolley and take several pictures as it passes by. So let's take a look here and see if we can get a good trolley going by so that we can photograph it. All right, so we've got a trolley coming now. Let's see what we can capture here. We'll get set up and, of course, focus and pan with the trolley, capturing several images as it goes by. It's important to try and capture as many images as possible when you have a subject like this, because the best image is going to be that one where you're panning exactly at the speed of your subject. So again, using around about 1/10 of a second shutter speed, that will give me that motion blur. Very dynamic scene. Of course, I can also use a faster shutter speed to try to freeze that motion, which works great in certain situations. I'm going to increase my ISO. In this case, I'll need to take it all the way up to about 1600 ISO, and that should give me a shutter speed on average around 250th of a second, and I'll still pan with the subject as it's going by. I'm going to pan with the trolley, and because I'm using a much faster shutter speed, that will ensure that it's not going to be completely sharp, but it'll give me a much sharper image than I would otherwise achieve, and it'll be mostly sharp. We'll still see some sense of motion, I'm sure, at that speed, 250th of a second based on the speed of these trolleys, but it should give me an interesting result. Here comes a trolley. And again, capturing multiple images. Whenever you're panning, it's very important that you capture multiple images in order to ensure you get one of them that's going to be as sharp as possible. There's going to be some variation. Obviously, you're not always going to be able to move exactly with the subject. So once again, it's certainly important to achieve a proper exposure, but in addition to accomplishing a proper exposure, you want to think about the specific settings you're using for the camera, and that includes both the aperture and shutter speed. In this particular case, I was mostly interested in the shutter speed so that I could render a moving subject either with a blur or in relative sharp focus, but I also need to think about the aperture in other situations. The key is to always be thinking about the many variables related to exposure so that you can accomplish the best result for the particular subject that you're photographing. Any scene you photograph will contain a variety of tonal values. Creating a proper exposure requires you to take into account those specific tonal values. And of course, we can measure the values using the meter in our camera in order to produce the best result. Here, I've created an artificial scene that will help us understand the concept of exposure. I have a very dark area, some black fabric over here, and I have a very bright area, almost white. And I can see that here I would have some challenges in terms of exposure. This basically represents a high dynamic range. Not as high as you might find out in the real world with a bright sky, for example, but it still gives us a sense of a range of tonal values. Now, of course, our camera's meter is assuming middle gray, so we can take a look at a gray card to understand this concept. Anytime the camera is measuring the light in the scene, it's trying to make the overall scene match middle gray in terms of luminance values. So in this case, for example, if I were to measure only the darkest area of the scene, the camera is going to see this area and try to make it appear as a middle gray. In this case, obviously brightening up that scene significantly. If I were to take a look at only the light area of this particular scene, the camera is going to see very bright values. It assumes it needs to make them a middle gray value in terms of tonality, and so it's going to darken down the scene significantly. And of course, if we're looking at a broader scene, an area that contains darks, middle values, and bright values, then the camera has to figure out what are those tonal values and how should it compensate. And of course, when it's measuring, you can gather information as well and perhaps compensate for the behavior of the camera relative to the scene. So let's take a look at how the camera actually operates under those circumstances. We have a variety of metering modes available to us. In most cases, we'll have at least 3, sometimes 4 metering modes. I have 4 metering modes available on this particular camera. And the basic situation here is that we're able to adjust either the area being affected by that metering mode, the area being measured by that metering mode, and also whether or not we want the camera to do any work in further evaluating the scene. So let's start off with the spot metering mode. I'll switch here to spot metering mode. And this metering mode is looking at the smallest area of the scene, about 1% to 4% of the overall scene, depending on the particular camera you're using, which means it's seeing a very small area and measuring based on that area. If I switch then to my partial metering mode, this is very similar to the spot metering mode. It's just evaluating a slightly larger area of the scene, typically around 8% of the overall frame. I'll switch now to what's called on my camera evaluative. Sometimes it's called multiple segment or multi-area. There's a variety of different names that it might be given, but this is a metering mode that is evaluating the entire scene that the camera sees, but then also applying some intelligence to that scene. It's essentially trying to figure out what you're taking a picture of and how to best compensate for that subject, for that particular scene. And then finally, I'll switch to my center-weighted metering mode. Again, like evaluative, this is looking at the entire scene that I'm photographing, but it's focusing its attention on the center. In other words, it's assuming whatever is in the middle of the frame is more important than what's around the edges of the frame. And we'll go ahead now and take a picture, take some metering of this particular scene. I'm using my manual metering mode, and what I'm going to do is switch back into my spot metering mode, and I'm going to focus my camera on a small area of this overall scene, approximately including half of the black area and half of the white area. But I'm going to place the center of the frame over on the white side. So now, because I'm using spot metering mode, I'm measuring a very small area of the white fabric only. The meter does not see the black fabric at all, and therefore it's trying to make that area appear middle gray. I'll go ahead and adjust my exposure settings now so that the meter is showing that I have a proper exposure based on that measurement. So I'm using manual mode and adjusting my aperture and shutter speed so that I have a proper exposure based on that white area of the fabric. Now I'll switch into my partial metering mode. Remember, this is looking at a slightly larger area than spot metering mode. I'm going to look at the exact same area on the fabric, and now, because I'm seeing a slightly larger area of the scene, I'm actually including some of the black fabric when I'm metering the scene. And therefore, the camera thinks that this exposure, which again was based on the white area, is going to be underexposed, in this case by about 1/2 of a stop. I can now switch into my evaluative metering mode, and once again I'll frame up the same subject, but because I'm now evaluating the entire area, not just a very small portion of the scene, but the entire area that I'm framing up, the camera thinks this scene is now 1 stop underexposed, even darker, obviously because it's seeing those dark areas, and therefore Since the metering was based on a very bright area, it's darkening up the overall scene. Essentially, the white area will appear gray, theoretically, in the final picture, and the dark areas will be even darker than they actually appear. And then switching to my center-weighted metering mode, and now I actually also get the same result. And that's because in this case, the edges of the frame versus the center of the frame, there's really no difference. And so focusing my attention in terms of metering on the center of the frame is not going to cause an appreciable difference compared to evaluative metering mode. So let's take a look at a more realistic example. I have a really cool old camera here that I'd like to photograph, and I'm going to set it up against this white background. Of course, the camera is quite dark, and so this represents a little bit of a challenge when it comes to metering the scene. I'll go ahead and start off in my spot metering mode. I'm going to switch to aperture priority so that we can see how the shutter speeds change when I'm capturing the image here. And I'll frame up the subject, and what I'm doing is including all of the camera, of course, and a bit of an area of white around the outside of the camera. So I'll meter the scene off of the spot metering mode, and now the meter is only looking at a very small area of the camera, the bellows in particular here. It doesn't see any of this white area. So I'll go ahead and meter there and take my picture, and I end up with whites that are completely blown out. And that's because the meter is looking at this dark area of the camera, assuming that we want it to be a middle gray tone, and therefore brightening up the overall scene so much so that the whites become completely blown out. No detail whatsoever. So let's take a look at the partial metering mode. I'll frame up my subject, again positioning the center right on the same spot, on the bellows of the camera there. And here I have also blown out highlights, not quite as much, and that's because I'm looking at a slightly larger area. Instead of looking at just one spot on the bellows, I'm looking at a slightly larger area of the scene, and therefore it's evaluating some additional tonal values. I have some highlights on the bellows, for example, but I'm still getting those whites fairly blown out. I'll switch to my evaluative metering mode. Now in this case, remember, I'm metering the entire scene, and the camera is trying to make an intelligent decision about a proper exposure. So even though I have a very high contrast scene, a relatively light background, and a relatively dark subject, the camera should be able to do a pretty good job here. And sure enough, I have maybe a tiny bit of detail blown out, but not too much at all. It's looking pretty good overall, and the camera looks fabulous. I'll go ahead and switch now to my center-weighted metering mode. Remember, this is where the meter is trying to measure mostly in the center. It measures the entire scene, but it considers whatever is in the center area of the frame to be most important. So it gives that a greater emphasis. And we end up with a little bit more blown out, and that's because we're focusing on the camera in terms of our metering. It's a dark subject, it's trying to brighten it up a little bit more, and so more of my background area gets blown out. So now that you understand these metering modes and how they work, you can consider how you might put them to use in your actual photography. In general, I would say that there are two basic options. Are you going to meter on a relatively small area of the scene, or are you going to meter the entire scene? And if you're going to focus on the entire scene, how are you going to handle that information? I consider the spot and partial metering modes to be very, very similar. The only real difference is which area of the frame is being evaluated. And so in most cases, if I were to choose one, it would be spot. And then I would meter off of something in the scene that I know to be approximately a neutral value. I could certainly use a gray card for that purpose, or I can look for something else within the scene that might match the gray card in terms of luminance. For example, a dark field of grass is very often close to a middle gray value. You might even, if you have a darkish complexion, you might even be able to use the back of your hand, in some cases the front of your hand. The key is to evaluate the scene and see what subjects might be matching in terms of a middle gray luminance. Otherwise, if you're not sure exactly where you could meter, then I would use an evaluative meter mode or the center-weighted metering mode. Evaluative would be the most commonly used, I would say, and for that we're evaluating the entire scene and then able to adjust the exposure accordingly based on an intelligent decision. In most cases, the camera is using some intelligence to try to figure out how to meter or how to compensate for the metering in the scene. And then center-weighted would be for situations where whatever falls in the center of the frame is most important. Now here, certainly certainly the center of the frame is very important. This camera is the key subject, but that can be problematic. So I would tend to use center weighted only for situations where the outer area of the image is much less important. For example, a sunset, typically the sun would be somewhere near the center of the frame, not necessarily right in the center, but in the overall center of the frame, and therefore you could use center weighted in that situation because that center is what you want to be most properly exposed. But the key is to understand that there are different metering modes. They're available to you in your camera, and if you understand them, you'll be able to put them to use in a variety of different situations in order to always ensure the best exposure possible. One of the things I enjoy most about visiting a new location is exploring new and interesting scenery. And here we've got some dramatic scenery in these mountains. A beautiful granite face rising almost straight up, some real interesting snow textures in the rocks and trees on the hill down below. And then a small village. We've got a house that almost looks like a castle or a church, and the lake in the foreground. Of course, lots of light and dark areas. Some dark areas in the lake, as well as light reflections. In the distance, a little bit of ice that's also going to reflect a fair amount of light. And this might lead you to believe that the exposure is actually going to be rather challenging, that it's a rather high dynamic range scene. But overall, this is actually a relatively low dynamic range. Most of the tonal values that you see here are actually relatively close to each other. The snow is certainly brighter than the rocks and brighter than the trees in the foreground, but taken as a whole, most of this scene is relatively even in terms of tonality. The dynamic range is not great, except for the sky. And you might not expect the sky to be especially problematic on a day like today because we have a relatively heavy cloud cover. But despite that cloud cover, we still have a sky that is much brighter than the rest of the scene here. So there's a good possibility that if I'm using an automatic exposure mode, that the meter in the camera is going to be fooled by this situation. So I need to take that into account as I'm framing up my scene. And that will probably call for some exposure compensation. In other words, I'm going to tell the camera to adjust from what it thinks is a proper exposure. Now, one of the other elements for the scene here is a very cool subject that I found, this tree stump with very interesting root structure that's sitting vertical here, and I'd like to incorporate that into my frame. Of course, this is going to introduce an additional challenge because, relatively speaking, even though it's a relatively diffuse light, we're going to have a backlighting situation. There's not a lot of light on the other side of the stump here, and that's going to cause a very dark subject relative to the rest of the scene. Now, I think overall it will match most of this scene, but it could prove additionally problematic with that sky. And so I'll need to take that into account as I'm adjusting my exposure settings in the camera. So let's get to the camera here and see what I can accomplish with this scene. Now, before I placed my tripod with a couple of legs in the water here, of course, I got a sense of how I wanted to frame up the scene, and originally was thinking about just the backdrop, but then found this tree stump and wanted to incorporate it. So I have everything framed up here just the way I liked it. I'm using an aperture of f/16 so that I can get a relatively deep depth of field, hopefully getting the trunk in the foreground as well as the mountains in the background in focus. And I'm ready to take my exposure. Now I'm evaluating the overall scene, and the camera is going to try to adjust the exposure to produce a proper exposure. And in this case, as I mentioned, we've got relatively dark for most of the frame and a bright sky. So I'm going to take my picture here and let's see what we end up with. And sure enough, the sky is pretty much completely blown out. The histogram is shifted far to the right and cut off on that right side, and I have the highlight warning, the blinking display, showing me that the sky is for the most part blown out, and even some of the snow on the mountaintop, of course, is blown out as well. And so I need to adjust the exposure. In essence, I'm trying to use an automatic exposure mode. I've set my aperture and I want the camera to do the work of figuring out what my shutter speed should be. But it's not doing a very good job in terms of metering this particular scene. So I need to tell the camera to make an adjustment, and to do that I'll utilize exposure compensation. So pressing the shutter release halfway, I can turn the dial here, and I think I'm going to reduce the exposure just by a half a stop to see if that will be enough to compensate for the relatively bright sky. So telling the camera to take its metering but then reduce my exposure by half, 1/2 of a stop, and let's see how that does. Better, a big improvement, but I still have a portion of the sky that's blown out. Since I'm capturing in RAW, it's possible that I would be able to pull that detail out in the RAW conversion process, but I'd rather be safe and make sure that I have as much detail as possible. I'm trying to expose relatively bright, but I do want to preserve all of that sky detail, if at all possible, so that I can see the sky, the cloud textures, etc. And so I'm going to adjust my exposure compensation now to a -1 stop. And I'll take the picture there, and we have a great result. I have no highlights blown out. The sky is retained completely. I can see that the histogram is shifted far over to the right, but no clipping. It's not being cut off over on that right-hand side, and none of the blinking display that indicates that the highlights have been lost. So by simply telling my camera to reduce the exposure by 1 stop, in essence, reducing the amount of light it's capturing by half, I'm able to produce an exposure that includes detail throughout, including both the foreground. I've not lost any shadow detail in the process in this particular case, but more importantly, preserving the sky. So when you're using an automatic exposure mode, you're depending upon the camera to do the metering for you in order to determine the best final settings for your capture. But as we've seen here, of course, in some situations, the camera's meter can be fooled by the lighting conditions or by the scene that you're photographing. So it's important to evaluate the image on your camera's LCD, for example, evaluating the histogram or the highlight warning display. But in some situations, that might not be an option. You might not have the opportunity to capture that image a second time. And so as you learn more and more about exposure, you can start to anticipate these needs. In this case, of course, a bright sky is a very common situation. And so looking at the scene, you could probably anticipate that we'll need to apply some form of compensation to the camera's automatic exposure setting. The more you learn about exposure, the easier that task will be, and the more you'll be able to anticipate the needs so that you can produce the best shot the first time. As you start to learn the concepts of exposure and how to apply those concepts to your photography, you may run into situations where you're not entirely confident about your exposure settings. For example, I have a scene here that is relatively high in contrast. I have some bright water. The water itself is obviously falling over the rocks, and we've got some whitewash there, so it's very bright. The dark rocks underneath the water, of course, are going to be a challenge, and I have a dark backdrop. And so this will be a challenge in terms of my exposure, and if I'm not entirely confident in my abilities or in the camera's metering or my adjustments, my settings, then I might want to have a little bit of help, and we can get that help through the use of exposure bracketing. Having the camera take multiple pictures, one a little darker than we might otherwise expect, one a little brighter, and hopefully one of those three will produce the best result. So let's take a look at how we can accomplish that in the camera. I'll go ahead and take a look through the viewfinder and get everything set up just the way I'd like it. In this case, capturing at f8, but I'm using aperture priority mode, and so the camera is doing all the work of determining the shutter speed for me. Well, I can make my life a little bit easier and have perhaps a little bit less stress if I adjust my bracketing so that the camera will automatically capture those three images. In this case, I don't have a really extreme dynamic range, so I don't think I'm going to need to adjust too significantly. So I'm going to set my exposure bracketing to set for 3 exposures, one a half stop underexposed, one based on the camera's metering, and one that's a half stop overexposed. So I'll go ahead and dial in that setting and make sure my focus is set. And then I need to set my camera to timer mode. I'll set that to a 2-second timer, which will ensure that it'll actually capture the bracketed shots in the case of my camera here. So we're ready to go. I'll activate the shutter, and after 2 seconds we get our 3 frames. I can take a look at those images on the viewfinder. I have one capture that was a half stop underexposed, and I'm losing some of the shadow detail. It's not too surprising considering that the rocks in the background are rather dark, they're in the shade. If I look at my normal exposure, which was based on the camera's metering, that looks like we've actually got a pretty good result. I might be able to go a little brighter, so let's take a look at the plus half stop exposure, and that looks actually to be spot on. That looks like the best exposure overall. So I didn't need to make much of an adjustment, but by using that exposure bracketing, the camera is just giving me a little bit more assistance. So if you don't feel entirely confident about your exposure settings, especially in a situation where the subject might be moving, you may not have very much time. In this case, I'm a little concerned with the clouds in the sky. They might move in front of the sun, and I no longer have the nice dramatic lighting that I'm looking for here. In those sorts of situations, you can use exposure bracketing to your advantage to help ensure that you get the best exposure possible. So we've got a beautiful snow-covered mountain here with some clouds passing through, and that's giving us some interesting lighting effects on the mountain. Now, because of the sun angle, the mountain is actually lit from the side, which introduces its own exposure challenges. And of course, with the snow on the mountain and intervals of shade, as well as sunlight directly on the mountain, the clouds in the sky, it's going to be a little bit of a challenge. Fortunately, if you understand exposure and you can evaluate the scene before you, you can utilize the camera's manual exposure mode to adjust aperture and shutter speed on your own in order to achieve an ideal exposure. Let's take a look at how we can use the manual exposure mode on the camera here. I've got everything framed up and focused and I'm ready to go. I'm going to go ahead and switch my camera into the manual exposure mode. And I've got the settings here at 1/180th of a second and an aperture of f/5.6. And by my metering, that's showing I'll be overexposed by about 1.5 to 2 stops, depending on where the clouds are at any given moment. The sunlight across the mountain is changing from moment to moment. And if I want to get an appropriate exposure, I'll need to make an adjustment. I'll go ahead and adjust my shutter speed. So I'll dial this down, and if I bring it down to 1/750th of a second at an aperture of f/5.6, now my meter indicates that I'll get a good exposure. Of course, with the sunlight hitting the snow, I know from experience that that snow is probably going to be blown out. And in this case, based on the overall scene, I think I only need to underexpose by about half a stop. So I'll go ahead and adjust my shutter speed down to 1/1000th of a second in order to accomplish an exposure that will be half a stop underexposed. Of course, I'm set to f/5.6. I'd rather ensure a little bit more depth of field in this particular case, so I think I'm going to go with f/8. So I need to figure out how to make an adjustment that will keep an appropriate exposure based on my rendering of the scene here while I'm changing the aperture and the shutter speed together. So I'll start off first by changing my aperture, and this is going to be 2 clicks. That's 1 stop since I'm working in half-stop increments. So going from f/5.6 to f/8, and now I need to adjust my shutter speed as well. So I'll go down to 1/500th of a second in this case. And I can just remember that it's 2 clicks, but of course I can always look at my exposure meter and see that I'm still a half stop underexposed in this particular case, which is exactly what I was trying to accomplish. Of course, the real question is, are those settings going to be appropriate? The challenge of manual exposure mode is that it's up to me. I'm not relying on the camera to make any adjustments. All the camera is doing is measuring the scene and giving me information on the exposure meter. I have to decide if I'm going to trust that exposure meter completely and what aperture and shutter speed I want to use. So in this case, I think we're going to be in good shape. I'll go ahead and capture an image here, and looking at the histogram, it looks great. Now, let's take a look. If I had made an adjustment that would cause the image to be exposed properly based on the meter, I'll go ahead and make the adjustment here and capture an image. And sure enough, I can see that some of the snow up on the mountain is blown out. I've lost that detail. So by exercising full control over the camera, it does mean I have to do a little bit more work, a little more thinking. I have to understand exposure. I have to be able to evaluate the scene before me. But using manual exposure mode gives me full control so I can produce the best result. Now, some photographers are concerned that working in manual mode is a bit more work. And to be fair, it sort of is in a lot of respects. If I were working in one of the more automatic exposure modes, for example, aperture priority, I can establish just the aperture and the camera will take care of the shutter speed. As I change the aperture, the camera automatically adjusts the shutter speed. So if I'm thinking primarily about depth of field, that works pretty well, and I can always apply some exposure compensation. But with manual exposure mode, I can actually take things a little bit further. In addition to thinking about the aperture at any given time, if I change scenes or if I look at a different subject, I can then switch my thinking to consider the shutter speed as my first priority. So I can think about either of those attributes. So at first glance, it might seem that the manual exposure mode involves a bit more work, and to some extent it does. You're adjusting 2 settings, your aperture and your shutter speed, rather than only adjusting one of those 2 settings and letting the camera do the rest of the work for you. But that gives you tremendous control. As long as you understand exposure and understand how you can read the scene before the camera, especially in situations where the light is changing or you're changing to different subjects relatively quickly, having that ability to read the scene, to understand exposure, and to adjust the settings on your camera quickly can help you tremendously when it comes to producing the best image. So I found this pile of ice on the side of the lake. It's very, very thick chunks of ice, but in relatively small pieces, almost like bricks or, relatively small stones. And I don't know how it got here. I would assume that somebody moved it, but maybe we've seen the tide moving today with the lake, and so maybe it was deposited here. I don't know, but it's fascinating, all the textures and the play of light here. And it's a very interesting scene to photograph because it's relatively narrow in terms of dynamic range, except for the very bright highlights, the specular highlights, where we're getting the sun reflected off little spots of the ice. And so as I'm adjusting my exposure for this, I'll probably need to apply an exposure compensation. The overall tone is very bright. The camera is going to try to meter that down to middle gray, and that of course is going to result in an image that's darker than it should be. And ideally I want to expose as bright as possible, and especially in this case I want to get every subtle bit of detail as possible, and it is a relatively bright scene anyway. So I'll need to think about that, but as I'm adjusting my exposure, I'd like to have a fair degree of precision here. Because I'm going to be increasing exposure, I want to bring it right up to the limit. I don't want to clip any highlight detail, other than of course the specular highlights, the reflections of the sunlight there. So I want to brighten up as much as possible without going over, without losing highlight detail. And instead of adjusting in half-stop increments, I'd therefore like to adjust in third of a stop increments. And most digital SLRs give you the option of choosing. Do you want to adjust half a stop at a time or 1/3 of a stop at a time? And that difference can be important in a variety of situations. And this is certainly a good example of that, where I want to be as precise as possible. So I'll go ahead and capture a normal exposure, letting the camera do the metering for me, and I end up with exactly what I would expect. Because this scene has a relatively narrow dynamic range, the only real exception being the specular highlights, the histogram shows a very narrow range of tonal values in the image. And that range of tonal values is centered on the histogram, indicating that the camera is trying to shift these very bright values toward middle gray. I, of course, want to apply an adjustment, an exposure compensation adjustment, but I want to exercise a bit more precision than I otherwise would. My camera, by default, adjusts the exposure in half-stop increments. So that I can push the exposure as bright as possible without losing any detail in the highlights, I want to adjust by 1/3 of a stop at a time instead of 1/2. That'll give me just a little bit more control. So I'm going to go into my camera settings here. On the menu, I need to adjust, in my case, a custom function, and I'll go ahead and set that to 1/3 stop increments for my exposure metering. And now I can apply an adjustment here. I'm going to try a +1 stop. That's fairly common exposure adjustment for snow, and I think in this case it'll probably work reasonably well. And that's actually worked quite well. I do have a few areas though where I've lost detail in the highlights, so I don't quite want a full stop. I'm going to dial it back. Now normally that would mean going down to a +1/2 stop exposure compensation, but because I've changed my camera settings here, I'm able to go down to a 2/3 plus stop exposure compensation. So go ahead and capture that image, and perfect. I've got all of the detail that I need, all that highlight detail, and I've been able to accomplish that by adjusting my exposure in smaller increments than I normally would. So by changing the camera to adjust in 3rd stop increments rather than half stop increments, I'm able to apply much more control over my exposure. Long exposures can produce very dramatic images for a variety of reasons. One of my favorite reasons is that it produces very rich, deep colors in situations that you do not expect them, very low lighting conditions. And also because it gives us an opportunity to capture motion, for example, moving lights. Here I have some cars going by in front of an opera house. The cars will have their lights on, of course, and I'm able to see the blur of those lights in a long exposure. So instead of seeing individual cars, I'll just see streaks of taillights and headlights. And of course, I have the building here dramatically lit. Of course, in addition to being very dramatic and very appealing in terms of the final image, long exposure has produced some serious challenges for us in terms of the actual exposure. To start with, we have very bright lights, street lights, lights illuminating the building, the headlights of cars, and we also have very dark areas. For example, here I have a park across the street that's not illuminated at all. That creates a very high dynamic range and a big opportunity to fool the camera's meter. And in fact, very often when you're metering a long exposure, you really can't trust the meter at all. Sometimes, in fact, the meter will simply not be able to give you a reliable reading at all. You'll need to experiment. Now, if you do include the sky in your exposure and you want to create an exposure based on the ambient light, you can meter off of the sky and then reduce the exposure by about 1 stop. That will include some dark detail in the sky, but also ensure that you're able to achieve a long exposure. We're going to use the bulb mode for long exposure, so I'll set my camera to bulb mode and adjust my aperture as desired. You can, of course, use just about any exposure mode to capture a long exposure, but I generally prefer to use the bulb exposure mode because it gives me a little bit more flexibility. I'm able to fly by the seat of my pants experimenting with different shutter speeds. Now, I also will make sure to use a cable release. This is necessary if I'm capturing at more than 30 seconds, but also helpful to ensure that I'm not imparting any vibration to the camera, and it just makes it a little bit easier to work. So I'll go ahead and get the camera set up here. In this case, I'm capturing at an aperture of f/16 to give me some good depth of field. I've got a lot of subjects to contend with, a building and some cars in the foreground, some other cars off in the background in the park. So be sure to think about that. And in particular, you're probably going to be narrowing down that aperture quite a bit, stopping down quite a bit so that you can get a longer shutter speed. And then I'll go ahead and make my exposure. So we'll go for about 15 seconds here using my cable release so that I don't, again, get that vibration in the camera. Now, one of the things to keep in mind when you're using a long exposure like this is that there's going to be heat buildup in the camera, and so noise becomes a particular problem. For that reason, you'll want to make sure that you turn on the long exposure noise reduction feature if your camera offers that. Once the capture has been achieved, we'll go ahead and take a look here. Yeah, we've got an image that is properly exposed in this case. I, of course, have done a little bit of testing to make sure that I was using an appropriate shutter speed for the conditions, and we get some nice streaks of light going through the scene. Now, it's going to take some practice and some testing, some experimentation to produce the very best results. There's tremendous variation from one scene to the next because of the very dramatic and extreme lighting conditions you're going to be dealing with in situations, dark lighting, where you're able to achieve an especially long exposure. So don't get frustrated if it takes a variety of different captures at different times to produce the very best results. Take the time to practice and test and experiment as best you can, and with time you'll get some very dramatic and wonderful images. Generally speaking, you'll be using ambient light or natural lighting to illuminate the scenes that you're photographing, but in certain situations you may actually need to add supplemental light. That could be because there's not enough natural light in the scene, or because you simply want to add light to certain areas of the scene. For example, we could use a flash unit in order to add light to a scene. That could be for primary lighting, the only light source being used, or for supplemental lighting. In this case, my camera actually includes a flash built into it, but I don't have quite as much control with that flash, and so in this case I'm going to use an external flash. Let's go ahead and take a look at how we can configure our camera utilizing that flash so that we can photograph a subject. Now in this case I'm going to photograph a model car just as an example of how we can utilize flash as a source of illumination. Now at a very basic level I can let the camera do all the work for me. For example, I'll use program mode, which is a fully automatic mode, and turn on the flash. I can make sure my subject is in focus and framed up properly, and I can simply fire a photo. Now, because I'm using program mode, I get a good exposure. The highlights are not too bright, the shadows are not too dark, but the lighting is a little bit harsh because I'm using a very strong lighting source close to the subject. I can modify that by using a different exposure mode or by changing the settings on my flash. I'm going to go ahead and switch to my aperture priority mode so that I can adjust my settings for the exposure. And I'm going to meter based on the actual available light. In this case, I have some light illuminating the car, but I want to add additional light, primarily as a fill light, to fill in details on the interior of the car, for example. So again, taking a picture with no compensation at all, just using the flash as it's set, but at a different exposure setting. So here, I'm taking an exposure that would actually be appropriate without the flash at all. You can see that's a longer shutter speed, and we get a much more natural look to the subject because now we're mixing our lighting. I'm using both available light as well as the flash as a source of supplemental illumination. Well, that's a much better result, but it's still a little bit harsh. So I'd like to tone down the flash. I'd like to have the flash be supplemental rather than a primary source of light. So I can adjust my exposure for the flash itself. I'll set my exposure compensation for the flash, in this case, to a -1 stop exposure compensation. That means the flash is providing half as much light as it had been in the previous exposure. The actual exposure for the camera will still be exactly the same because I'm metering based on ambient light. We'll take that picture, and now I have a much better result. I'm still filling in the details, softening up the overall lighting on the car, but I'm mixing that light with ambient light so I get a very natural, pleasing appearance in my image. Let's take a look at another example, this time with a moving subject. Obviously, a car is designed to move, and we're going to photograph this car in motion. In order to capture a moving subject and show that it's actually moving, we would likely want to use a relatively slow shutter speed. But I can combine flash with that ambient light, with the slow shutter speed, in order to illuminate the subject with a very strong burst of light that will give me partially sharp focus. The subject itself will be in sharp focus for part of the frame, but then I'll be able to see the blur motion. Now, to make this a little easier, I'm going to use a cable release. So I'll go ahead and plug the cable release into the camera here. And I'll get the car positioned. I'm still using a -1 stop exposure compensation. I've already figured out for this particular scene that that will produce a more pleasing result. And now I want to photograph this subject in motion. So I'm going to go ahead, using the cable release to trigger the camera. I'll go ahead and push the car through the scene and fire off a shot as the car passes through. So again, I have, in this case, I can take a look and see the car is rendered relatively sharp because I'm illuminating it with the flash. So even though it's moving and I'm using a slow shutter speed, I'm still using flash illumination to provide a bright light source that essentially freezes the car in motion. But once the flash is no longer illuminating the scene, I'm continuing to capture an ambient exposure. Of course, the flash fires at the beginning of the scene, at the beginning of the capture, and so as the car continues to move, that blurring effect is moving in front of the car. In the final picture, that makes it look like the car was moving backwards. The blur goes in front of the car rather than behind the car. Well, we can solve for this by firing the flash at the end of the frame instead of at the beginning of the frame. So at the end of the capture rather than the beginning. I'll go ahead and on the menu for the camera here, I can adjust my flash control, and for my external flash, I'll set my shutter synchronization to second curtain instead of first curtain. And what that means is that the flash will fire at the end of the exposure rather than at the beginning of the exposure. So once again, everything is set up just as I've left it. I'll push the car through the scene, and now the flash fires at the end of the exposure, thus still rendering the car in sharp focus, but not until after it has already moved through the scene. So now initially the car is going to be a blur because I'm using a relatively long shutter speed as the car moves through the frame, but then I fire that flash to produce a sharp version of the car, as it were, at the end of its motion. And that enables me to produce a very dramatic, dynamic result utilizing flash to supplement the available light. Now obviously here we've taken a look at a few examples that are very basic and very straightforward. You can certainly get much more sophisticated by employing multiple flash units, by using studio light setups, and a variety of different options in terms of artificial light. But the key concepts remain the same. You need to consider the role of that artificial light just as you would with natural light when calculating an exposure. The key thing is to take into account the behavior of the flash, of that artificial light source, to consider how it's interacting with your natural light source and to adjust your exposure settings accordingly. Sometimes instead of creating a proper exposure with a single frame, you might want to use multiple frames for that purpose. This would be the realm of the double exposure or multiple exposure. And there's a variety of ways you can accomplish this, obviously creating a very interesting image along the way. But it requires you to think a little bit differently about the actual exposure. Here, for example, I have some flowers arranged just in a little bit of a still life, and I'd like to create a multiple exposure effect using these flowers. What I'll do is capture the flowers from different angles, and I will then blend those images together in the computer in order to create an abstract image. Now, if I were to simply meter and photograph the flowers and then blend them together, of course, I'm not adding up multiple exposures into a single frame that will still have a proper exposure. Think about exposure. We're producing an image by capturing a certain amount of light. If the image is too light or too dark, then obviously the exposure is not correct. So here, if I were to capture a proper exposure and then add another picture to that result, I would be adding more light. I would be brightening up the ultimate result. So instead, for example, if we were capturing a multiple exposure that was comprised of only 2 images, instead of having twice as much light as we would normally want, we want to have a final exposure that is normal. That means instead of having double the normal amount of light, therefore an image that is twice as bright as it should be, we'll capture images that are too dark. Now there's actually a formula that you can use here, and by understanding exposure we can very easily get started. If we're combining two images and we want the final result to have a proper exposure, that means each of those images needs to comprise half of the final lighting. So we'll need two images exposed one stop underexposed. Let's go ahead and capture a couple of these images here. I'll frame up the subject. I'm using aperture priority mode. And so all I need to do is set my aperture and I can capture an image. The shutter speed will adjust automatically and I can just change my angle, taking different perspectives of the flowers here, perhaps different zoom settings, focusing in on different areas of the image. Now, if I capture it one stop under, remember each stop represents half or double the light, so for a proper exposure we would be, as we could say, even exposure. -1 is half as much light, and so if we add two exposures together, each with half of the total light, that comes together as a proper exposure. Now, if we were taking things a step further, for example, combining 4 images, we would then need to underexpose each image by 2 stops. The trouble is with a digital capture that sometimes that will end up causing a lot more noise than we would like to see, and also in many cases we're not sure exactly how many images we're going to want to put together in that final multiple exposure. So as a general rule of thumb, I typically use a one-stop underexposure setting for all situations when I plan to create a multiple exposure. That said, if you want to produce a multiple exposure with more images, you certainly could adjust your compensation accordingly. So for example, if we were combining 4 images, we would want to combine all of those images at a -2 exposure compensation, allowing us to add together all of those exposures to produce the right amount of light. If I were to capture all of my images at a -1 exposure compensation and I add more than 2 images, I'll still need to make some adjustments after blending those images. Certain digital cameras actually include the ability to produce a multiple exposure right in the camera. But in general, you'll have to take those images and put them together in the computer using software such as Photoshop to blend the multiple exposures. In any case, when you're producing multiple exposures, it's important to understand the concept of exposure so that you'll understand exactly how to adjust your captures in the camera in the first place so that you'll get good results in the final composition. Producing a proper exposure involves measuring the light in the scene you're going to photograph and then adjusting your camera settings based on that light in order to produce the best result possible. But sometimes the scene works against you in this respect. Here I have a beautiful mountain scene, a lake in the foreground with a rocky shore. The mountains are cast a little bit in the shade, the sun is out, it's very, very bright, and so we end up with an extreme dynamic range. In fact, this camera is not going to be able to reproduce all of the tones that are found here. The trees against the hillside are very, very dark, the clouds in the sky, the blue sky, very bright. I've got some ice in the foreground and the water reflecting the sunlight that's going to be extremely bright. And so the difference between the brightest area of the image and the darkest area of the image is rather extreme, more than I can capture in a single frame, and so I'm going to capture multiple frames. This is called high dynamic range imaging because we're capturing a high dynamic range and then compressing it into a single final result. In this case, that requires me to capture multiple images. For this particular scene, I think I'll be able to capture 3 frames and then bring them together later. So I'll capture 1 frame that will bring out all of the shadow detail, 1 frame that will be primarily for the midtones. That's going to be closest to what I would capture if I were shooting a normal scene here. And the bright frame will capture all of the highlight detail. I can then bring those images together to produce the final image. Of course, I could make these adjustments manually. I could take 1 frame, make an adjustment, and capture an additional frame, but in most cases it's a lot easier to let the camera do that work for you with exposure bracketing. In particular, that helps to ensure that I'm capturing the images as close together as possible in terms of the timing so that any changes, movement within the frame, for example, can be compensated for more easily. So let's take a look at what the exposure might look like here. I'm using, in this case, aperture priority mode. I've set the camera to f/16 so I can get a relatively deep depth of field. And we'll meter, in this case, just using evaluative metering, letting the camera try to do all the work for me, and we'll capture the frame. And as I might have expected, portions of the sky and the reflections in the water are very much blown out. I've lost all detail there. And looking at the histogram, I think I might not have lost all of the detail in the shadows, but I'm very, very close to doing so. So I'm going to configure exposure bracketing. I'll go ahead to my menu here, and in this case, if I were to capture a normal frame, I would probably underexpose by about half of a stop so that I can try to retain as much detail in the sky as possible. And that will then become my middle exposure, sort of my baseline exposure. I also want one capture that's going to be one stop darker and a capture that will be one stop brighter. So with my exposure bracketing, I'll first set my exposure compensation. I'll turn the dial so that my baseline exposure will be 1/2 stop underexposed. I'll then instruct the camera that I want 2 additional exposures, that's the default setting here, and in this case that I want each of those to be 1 stop either below or above my baseline setting. So I'll establish that setting there. And in this case, for my camera, in order to accomplish that exposure bracketing, I need to use one of my timer modes. If I were to simply press the shutter release, I would end up with only 1 frame. So I'll adjust my camera here so that we will set the timer for 2 seconds. And now everything is configured properly. In fact, I can even see on my meter display the indication that I'll get 3 exposures, 1 baseline and 1 above and 1 below. So we'll capture that, press the shutter, 2 seconds, and I get 3 frames all at once. We can take a look at those exposures on the LCD here. And so now, because again, my baseline exposure was 1/2 underexposed, I will have an exposure, and this is for the highlights, that will be 1.5 stops underexposed. And that looks good. I've lost some shadow detail, but that's okay. We'll get that elsewhere. Most importantly, I have not clipped any highlight detail. Taking a look at the second exposure, the baseline exposure, here I have, I think, it looks like no loss of detail in the shadows, but a little bit of loss of detail in the highlights. And going to my third exposure, now I have definitely all the detail in the shadows, but the highlights are quite significantly blown out. I've lost all that detail. So in a situation where the dynamic range of the scene exceeds your camera's ability to record all of that information, we can capture multiple frames through high dynamic range imaging and then use special software to bring those images together to produce a final result that includes all the detail we're looking for in the photograph.
Using the RAW capture mode on your digital camera helps ensure you'll have maximum flexibility and control when optimizing your images. When it comes to exposure, that translates into an ability to capture a greater range of tonal values in the scene compared to capturing in JPEG mode. RAW capture also enables you to compensate to some degree for exposures that were slightly less than ideal. A RAW capture is not really an image file, but rather a data file that contains the information gathered by the image sensor during capture. As a result, you'll need to process the RAW capture in order to be able to put the photo to use with most software. Let's take a look at the basic process of converting a RAW capture to an actual image. In this case, I'm using Photoshop to process my RAW capture, but you could use a wide variety of software tools for this purpose. In this case, to get started, we'll choose File, Open from the menu, and then navigate to the location that contains the file I want to work with and choose that file. In this case, I'm going to use the Rock Layers image, so I'll choose it and click Open. As you'll notice, the image doesn't actually open up immediately in Photoshop, but rather via Adobe Camera Raw. This is a special processing engine within Photoshop that allows us to process RAW captures and convert them to actual pixel values so that we can continue working on the image in Photoshop. We'll get started with the adjustments that affect exposure, the overall tonality of the image, over on the basic settings on the right-hand side of Adobe Camera Raw. You'll notice we have an exposure slider. This is actually a little bit different from the overall concept of exposure you might be familiar with in the camera. In this case, think of exposure as more of a white point adjustment. In other words, how bright should the brightest values in the image be? Should they be pure white or a little bit less than that? And in fact, we can boost this value so much so that pixels that should not even be close to white actually appear white. So you need to be careful as you're adjusting this particular control. Let's take a look at how it works. If I drag the slider over to the left, the image is darkened. If I drag it over to the right, the image is brightened. And if I drag it too far to the right, the image is brightened so much that we lose detail in the brightest areas of the image. As you're working, you can watch the histogram, and this gives us some sense that the dark areas, those on the left end of the histogram, aren't being affected quite as much as the bright areas, the portions of the histogram over at the far right. We can work a little bit more intelligently with this control by holding the Alt key on Windows or the Option key on Macintosh. If you hold the Alt or Option key while adjusting exposure, you'll see a clipping preview. Initially, the image will likely be entirely black, but as I increase the value, I'll start to see pixels appearing. Those pixels indicate where in the image I'm losing detail. A colored pixel indicates that one or more channels are losing information, while a white pixel indicates that all three channels, red, green, and blue, have been clipped and those areas of the image will appear absolutely white. In most cases, I would never want to clip detail in the raw conversion if at all possible, and so my basic practice is to increase until I start to see pixels and then back off until the last of those pixels disappear. There are, of course, exceptions. If you have specular highlights, bright reflections off shiny objects, then those areas of the image are going to be blown out regardless. And of course, in some cases, the brightest areas of the image are not even nearly white. And with some images, the brightest areas of the image shouldn't be pure white. For example, on a foggy day, most of the tonal values are going to fall in the middle range of the overall luminance that's available to you. In other words, if the dynamic range of the scene was very low, you may not need the exposure value to be increased all the way until the white values appear in the clipping preview. What that means is the clipping preview of the exposure slider is a very helpful tool, but you still need to look at the actual image in order to determine the best possible setting. The recovery slider allows us to recover a bit of highlight detail if things got a little bit too bright in those highlights. I generally don't need to use the recovery slider for two reasons. One is that I try to make sure that the in-camera capture does not contain any blown-out highlights. I also try to make sure that my exposure adjustment is optimized so that I'm not losing any highlight detail. That said, in some cases, toning down the highlights can help us perceive more detail in those areas. Think of the recovery slider as a fill flash, but instead of brightening up shadow detail, we're pulling in more detail in our highlights. In this case, I don't need recovery, so I'll set it back down to 0, and I'm going to skip fill light for the moment and take a look at blacks. This is the opposite of exposure. Now keep in mind, dynamic range indicates the difference between the lightest area and the darkest area, and blacks controls, of course, the black point. If we want to maximize dynamic range, we'll want the darkest pixels in the image to be about black, so I'm going to hold once again the Alt or Option key, Alt on Windows and Option on Macintosh, as we saw with the exposure slider, and this will give me the clipping preview display as I adjust the blacks. The concept is the same, the image is just inverted. Instead of starting out all black, it starts out all white, but the pixels that appear indicate clipping. Once again, I don't want to clip the shadows if I can avoid it, so I'll back off the black slider until all of those pixels disappear. In this case, you can see that even with a value of 0, I still had some clipping of the blacks, so I'll leave it at that 0 value. I can then fine-tune the overall aesthetic in terms of tonality by adjusting brightness and contrast. In this case, I'd like to brighten up the image just a little bit and increase contrast a little bit as well. I've adjusted my overall tonal range using exposure and blacks, exposure for the white point and blacks for the black point, but I can fine-tune the overall image as I'd like using the brightness and contrast controls. I also want to make sure the overall color looks good at this point, so I'm going to adjust my white balance controls. Here, I'll use temperature to adjust the color balance between blue and yellow. In this case, I think the scene was a little bit too blue, so I might like to warm it up just a little bit from where it started. And then I can use the tint slider as needed to adjust the color between green and magenta. Now, of course, the tint slider tends to be more corrective than creative. We don't tend to want to add a green or magenta color cast to our image, so this is just about getting the color as close to ideal as possible. With the temperature slider, on the other hand, I might want to cool the image down or warm it up just a little bit, depending on my own personal preference, taking it beyond what the scene actually looked like when I photographed it. That looks pretty good, so I think I'm finished with my basic adjustments. There are certainly many other adjustments here, but we're not going to focus on those at this point. I do want to check my output settings, so I'll click the link below the preview image in Adobe Camera Raw in order to bring up the Workflow Options dialog. In most cases, I work with the Adobe RGB color space, and that's a good choice if you're just getting started. Of course, if you have a reason to use a different color space, such as ProPhoto RGB or sRGB, you can certainly choose one of those options, but we'll stick with Adobe RGB here. I want to work in the 16 bits per channel mode if at all possible. Now, not all software supports 16-bit per channel, but if it does, I do recommend working in 16-bit because this will help ensure that we're able to produce the very best results. Specifically, by working in 16-bit, even with strong adjustments, you'll be able to avoid posterization, the loss of smooth gradations of tone and color within the image. I'll leave the size set to its default. I just want to convert the image from RAW to pixels utilizing the camera's native resolution. And speaking of resolution, I can change the pixel per inch resolution if I'd like. This setting does not affect the RAW conversion, but rather is a convenient setting. If you use a particular output setting on a regular basis when printing your images, you can set that here to save a step later. I don't like applying sharpening, so I'll leave that turned off, and I'm not going to use a smart object in this case, so I'm all set. I'll go ahead and click OK to accept those workflow options, and now I'm ready to open the image. So I'll go ahead and click the Open Image button, and the image will be processed by Photoshop and then opened so that I can get to work on this image with further adjustments. There are many software tools that allow you to manage, process, and optimize RAW captures. In this lesson, we've taken a look at the most basic capabilities of Adobe Camera Raw in Photoshop. There are many software tools that allow you to manage, process, and optimize RAW captures. In this lesson, we've taken a look at the most basic capabilities of Adobe Camera Raw in Photoshop. There are certainly many other very advanced features available as well. But regardless of the software you're using, the key is to focus on the critical elements of image processing in order to create a result that represents the best possible interpretation of the information your digital camera recorded when the photo was originally taken. It should go without saying that the key to producing a great photograph is ensuring you capture the very best image with your camera in the first place. That said, in most cases, you'll want to refine and optimize the final image after capture to help achieve your vision for a photo, as well as, in some cases, to produce a creative interpretation of the scene. In this lesson, we'll take a look at a basic tonal adjustment that involves setting the values for black, white, and middle gray. Let's get started. Here I'm using Photoshop, but of course you could use just about any image editing software in order to apply this type of adjustment. Here I'm going to use the Levels adjustment. I'll go ahead and go to the Adjustments panel and click on the button to add a Levels adjustment layer. You can see I've added the Levels adjustment layer and I can adjust my various controls in the Adjustments panel. What I want to focus my attention on is the white point. The black and white point set the overall dynamic range for the scene. Obviously, we have to consider dynamic range when calculating our exposure in the first place, but after the capture, we can refine our dynamic range. Specifically, we can increase the dynamic range of the final image. In other words, if we don't have a pure black or pure white pixel in the image, we can make adjustments so that we do, therefore expanding the dynamic range of the scene. Let's consider the white point first. The white point allows me to specify which tonal value in the image will become white. If I were to drag the white point slider below the histogram over to the left, what I'm telling Photoshop is that I want a different tonal value than white to be considered white. For example, with the adjustment I've just applied, any pixel in the image that has a tonal value of approximately middle gray or brighter will become white. You can see in the image that this is not exactly a pleasing effect. We've lost a tremendous amount of detail in the highlight areas of the image, and actually in many of the midtones as well. Looking at the histogram on the Adjustments panel, you can see that a huge amount of information has been lost. All of these pixel values represented by the right half of the histogram are now completely white. This, of course, represents a bad adjustment, but then the question is, what would be a good adjustment? With most images, you'll find that expanding the dynamic range of the image will produce a better result. What that generally means is that we want the brightest pixels in the image to become white or nearly white. And we can get a better sense of that by holding the Alt key on Windows or the Option key on Macintosh while adjusting our white point. This will give us a clipping preview. This display shows us where and to what extent in the image we are losing information based on our adjustment. In most cases, we don't want to lose any information, and so we'll make an adjustment that comes just up to the point of losing detail and then back off just a little bit. So right about there, it looks like I've maximized the bright values in the image without clipping any detail at all. It's worth noting that in this case, if I do start to clip a little bit of detail, it's only the red channel initially that's actually losing information. The color of the pixels that are displayed indicates which channel or channels are losing information. And once you see white pixels, those pixels are actually being converted to a pure white value. In most cases, you definitely want to avoid having pixels become pure white, but in certain cases, you might clip one or more of the channels, the individual color channels, in order to produce a more dramatic result in the image. But in this case, I don't think I want to lose any detail in the highlights, so I'm just going to bring my adjustment inward a little bit until just the point where I start to see the first pixels appearing in that clipping preview display. In this case, because the image was reasonably well exposed from the start, the adjustment for the white point is rather modest. I've gone from a value of 255, the definition of white in this case, to 249, not very significant at all. Let's take a look at the black point. The same basic concept applies. I'm adjusting the image, defining which pixel values will have the appearance of black. In this case, for example, I'm dragging that black point slider into about the midtone value, and you can see that many, in fact probably more than half of the pixels in the image, are now completely black. That's obviously not the adjustment I'd like, and once again I can use the clipping preview to make a more informed decision about my adjustment. Holding the Alt key on Windows or Option key on Macintosh, we can see where we're losing detail. And again, the colors indicate which channels are losing information, and black would indicate that the pixels have been clipped all the way to black. So in this case, I don't want to give up any shadow detail either, so I'll adjust to the point where no pixels are displayed. That looks pretty good right there. A value of 5, where the starting point was 0, so a similar adjustment compared to my white point in terms of the extent of that adjustment, and now I have maximized the tonal range in the image. I've set the brightest pixel to nearly white and the darkest pixel to nearly black, helping to give my image a little bit more impact and contrast. Finally, we can take a look at the midtone value. This is very similar to the white point and black point. It simply sets a tonal value for middle gray. In other words, which pixel values in the image should become middle gray. If I move toward the right, I'm saying that I want more pixel values to be darker than middle gray, and if I move to the left, I'm saying that I want more pixel values to be brighter than middle gray. As a result, moving to the right darkens and moving to the left brightens. The question is, what value should I use? And in this case, I don't have the benefit of a clipping preview the way I do with the black and white point sliders. Instead, I'm going to have to trust my eye to determine what value works best for optimizing the image. In this case, I think I'll darken down just a little bit to add some density, to give a little bit more impact to some of the darker areas and to help enrich the colors just a little bit. So I'll slide that slider just a little over to the right from its starting position, and that has redefined middle gray, adjusting overall brightness in the image in order to produce a more pleasing result. I'll go ahead and turn off the visibility for my levels adjustment layer, and you can see the before version, and then I'll turn the adjustment back on, and you can see the after version. So between the before and after version, you'll notice that the adjustment is relatively subtle in this case, and that's a good thing. That means that my overall exposure in the camera was actually pretty good, and there are very few adjustments needed in order to optimize the overall tonality of the image. Regardless of what software you're using to optimize your digital photos, you'll want to explore the adjustments that enable you to establish values for black, white, and a middle tone in your images. These controls allow you to fine-tune the exposure for an image after the capture and ensure the best starting point for further adjustments. Photoshop includes an adjustment called Curves that allows you to exercise tremendous control over the tonality and even the color of an image. And in fact, other photo editing software also includes similar adjustment controls. In this lesson, we'll take a look at the relatively basic use of curves in Photoshop to give you a sense of the higher degree of control provided by this type of adjustment. I want to preserve the original pixel values in my image, so I'll utilize an adjustment layer to apply changes to the appearance of this photo rather than applying the adjustment directly to the image itself. So on the Adjustments panel, I'll go ahead and click the button for the Curves adjustment in order to add a Curves adjustment layer. I can then apply the adjustment using the controls on the Adjustments panel. The first thing I'll want to take a look at is the black point and white point controls for curves. This allows me to set the value of black or white in the image. In other words, I can adjust pixel values in the image so that they become pure black or pure white. Let's take a look at the basic concept here. If I drag the white point slider over to the left, I'll be brightening the image because I'm causing particular pixel values to be remapped to white. In this case, for example, you can see that I'm blowing out highlight detail in the image because I've caused pixels that originally had a value of somewhere around a mid-tone to become completely white. That obviously does not produce a good result in this case, so we'll adjust our white point slider here to a more appropriate level, and that generally will mean making the brightest area of the image, the rightmost portion of the histogram, become white or nearly white. We can employ the clipping preview display, holding the Alt key on Windows or the Option key on Macintosh, to get a better sense of where we might be losing detail in the image. If I hold the Alt or Option key while adjusting my white point slider, I can see exactly where and to what extent I'm losing detail in the highlights. I don't want to lose any detail, or maybe just a little bit of detail to accentuate the highlight detail, make it a little bit more contrasty in the overall image, so I might make my adjustment down to about there. Similarly, I can hold the Alt or Option key while I adjust the black point, moving the slider over to the right. And you can see once again the clipping preview display shows me where I'm losing detail. In this particular case, I don't want to lose any shadow detail. I do want to optimize the tonal range, but I don't want to sacrifice tonal detail. And actually, in this case, my exposure was perhaps just slightly underexposed, and so even with the slider all the way at the left, you can see I'm losing just a little bit of detail in the image. Adjusting the white point and the black point has helped to expand the tonal range within the image, but I feel that the image is still a little bit too light. By moving the curve up or down, I can brighten or darken the image respectively. So for example, I'll click in about the center of the curve and then drag upward to brighten the image or downward to darken the image. You can see this gives us a relatively basic ability to adjust the overall tonality of the image. But it's not giving me quite as much control as I'd like to exercise. Instead, I'm going to take this anchor point that I've just added onto the curve and move it down over into the shadow area simply by dragging on it. I'll then click and drag downward a little bit in order to darken the shadow areas of the image. We can see that corresponds to the dark areas on the gradient at the bottom of our histogram display. I can then brighten up the brighter areas of the image by working higher up on the curve. I'll simply click and drag on the curve up near the bright point, and I'll fine-tune my dark point just a little bit, and you can see that I'm increasing overall contrast. That's reflected by an area of the curve that is steeper than its original starting point. You'll see that I have the original starting point for the curve indicated by this gray line, and I can use that to help me read the curve. In the darker shadow areas, you'll see that my curves adjustment has come down just ever so slightly, so I'm just darkening the shadows a little bit. But on the brighter areas of the image, you can see that I've pushed my curve upward significantly, so I'm applying a relatively strong increase in brightness to the brighter areas of this image. So I've brightened the highlights and darkened the shadows just a little bit, and the result is an overall increase in contrast for the midtones of the image. This type of adjustment is referred to as an S-curve because it somewhat resembles an S if you take a look at the shape of the curve here. Obviously not exactly the letter S, but you can see how it is reminiscent of an S. And that allows me to increase overall contrast without losing detail in the image. I've increased contrast for the midtones, but then the adjustment tapers off toward the black or white points. Now this is all well and good in theory, and hopefully this is giving you a better sense of how curves operates, but let me show you how I recommend getting started with this curves adjustment so that you can better put it to use in your images. I'm going to click on each of my anchor points that are in the middle of the curve and just drag them off the curve until they disappear to get rid of them. I'll leave my adjustments for the black point and the white point where they are. I want to focus on the general midtone values in the image. So I'm going to turn on the On Image Adjustment, this hand icon with the vertical double-headed arrow, and then I'll move my mouse out over the image. If I point to an area, you'll see that the curve display on the adjustments panel has a circle that indicates which tonal value is underneath my mouse at any given time. If I point to a relatively dark area, it will be down toward the left side of the curve, and if I point to a relatively bright area, it'll be toward the right side of the curve. What this enables me to do is apply a direct adjustment by working with the image itself. So for example, if I wanted to brighten up some of the highlight areas, some of the brighter portions of the image, I can simply point to a representative area of the image and then click and drag upward to brighten. I can also point to a darker area of the image and in this case click or drag downward to darken. Of course, I don't always need to brighten the highlights and darken the shadows. In some cases, maybe I want to brighten up the shadows just a little bit, in which case I could drag upward. So by using this approach of working directly on the image, clicking and dragging upward to brighten an area or downward to darken an area, we're able to apply a sophisticated adjustment with ease. Keep in mind that whenever I apply an adjustment to a particular area, for example, if I point to this piece of wood here, the bark on the outside of this piece of wood, I'm not really saying I want to adjust the wood, I'm saying I want to focus my adjustment on tonal values in the image that match this area. So I'm really affecting the entire image, emphasizing the adjustment on a particular tonal range. But notice that as I adjust the darks, for example, the dark areas throughout the entire image are affected. But again, by working with the on-image adjustment, I can exercise great control without having to deal with the intricacies of curves. In this lesson, we've taken a relatively basic look at the curves adjustment. Hopefully this provides you with a better sense of what's possible in post-processing and gives you some ideas of how you might approach the optimization of your photos. And of course, in the process, we've also reinforced just how helpful it can be to achieve an ideal exposure in the camera to help minimize the amount of work you need to perform with software after the capture. In certain cases, photographers might produce what is called a high-key image, where highlight details are intentionally blown out and many areas of the image appear quite bright. In theory, you could produce such an image in the camera by simply overexposing the photo. However, I prefer not to take this approach because it means I'm throwing away information and limiting my options for interpreting a given photo in post-processing. Therefore, even when I want to produce a high-key image, I tend to capture the photo with a proper exposure, and then create the high-key effect when applying adjustments to the photo. Here, for example, I have an old camera set against a white rug background, and it certainly would have been easy to overexpose this capture to produce an effect where the white background is blown out. But I'd rather have a little bit more creative flexibility, and so I captured the image with a proper exposure. I'll use a curves adjustment to create my high-key effect. I'll go ahead and add a curves adjustment layer, and my first step will be to bring the white values up, causing some detail to be lost in the highlights. So I'll grab my white point adjustment and click and drag it to the left so that pixel values in the image that had been a very bright shade of gray are now going to become pure white. I don't want to lose all of the detail in the image, just the brightest highlights, so somewhere around there looks like it might work pretty well. I'll go ahead and fine-tune just a little bit, and that's looking pretty good as a starting point. I can also adjust my black point. Now, in general, we would use the black point slider, dragging it inward to cause other pixels in the image to become black even though they had been not quite black, just a dark value. However, since I'm producing a high key effect in this case, I actually might want to tone down the black values. I could accomplish that by clicking on the end point for the curve and dragging it upward for black. As you can see, this will cause blacks to become murky and gray, which is not necessarily the desired effect for a given image. The point is that I can apply this type of adjustment, and it might actually be appropriate for a high-key image. In this case, I think I'll tone down those blacks just a little bit, maybe up to about there. Then I can set about fine-tuning the overall tonality, applying mid-tone adjustments. And so I could darken or lighten some of the dark areas of the image, and of course darken or lighten some of the brighter tones. In this case, I think I'll emphasize the adjustment a little bit more toward the brighter tones in the camera, and I could even take that significantly higher if I wanted to, fine-tune contrast here, but I don't want to lose too much detail in that background. You can see by brightening everything up, I've really blown out the background, so I can apply an additional adjustment to that curve to help flatten out the curve in the brightest portions of the image, helping to retain some of that detail. The concept here is that we want to have the highlight areas completely blown out or almost completely blown out. We want very little detail in the brightest areas of the image, and we might even want to tone down contrast in some of the darkest areas. Obviously, with any adjustment, you're in control as the photographer, so you get to decide what the best effect is for that image. But the general concept for a high-key image, of course, is that we're brightening up the highlight detail to the point that it's actually blown out in large part. But of course, you can interpret the image however you see fit. The high-key effect obviously relates to exposure, and it's certainly possible to achieve such an effect by overexposing an image in camera. In this lesson, we've explored how it is possible to achieve the same effect in post-processing allowing you to capture a proper exposure in camera and then produce a creative interpretation of the photo after the fact. This greatly increases your flexibility in interpreting any photo. There are a variety of ways you might create a unique interpretation of a scene, and the multiple exposure is certainly one of those possibilities. Whenever I create a multiple exposure image, I tend to focus on subjects with interesting textures and patterns, assembling photos taken at different angles or perspectives to create an abstract result. To produce the best multiple exposure effect, it's necessary to underexpose the original captures. For example, if we're assembling two images, we would want to underexpose each of them by one stop, so that each capture is gathering half as much light as we would for a normal exposure. Therefore, the two halves add up to a proper exposure for the final composition. I actually tend to use a one-stop underexposure when capturing images for multiple exposures, even if I'm not sure how many images I will assemble in the final result. I can then use adjustments to help compensate for the overall tonality of each image. Allow me to show you how I would approach this effect in Photoshop. The first step is to assemble my multiple images into a single document. I generally use Bridge for this purpose. I'll go ahead and click on the first image in my sequence and then hold the Shift key and click on the last image in the sequence in order to select all of those images. I'll then choose Tools, Photoshop, Load Files into Photoshop Layers from the menu. When I choose this option, the images will be opened in Photoshop and assembled into a single document consisting of multiple layers. You can see in this case, each of my original files is now an individual layer on the Layers panel. Since these images were captured at one stop underexposed, they're appropriately exposed for blending two images together to create a multiple exposure effect. And that's what I'm going to start with. I'll turn off the visibility for my first and second layers, looking at the third and fourth image layers, and we'll assemble these two layers into a single composite result. What I need to do is blend these two exposures together, brightening the final result. In other words, adding together the light to produce a properly exposed multiple exposure. The only thing we need to do in order to accomplish that is to change the blend mode for my upper image layer to the screen blend mode. This is a lightening blend mode that will cause the final result to be lighter than the original, and that produces a good effect in terms of a multiple exposure. I'll go ahead and choose the screen blend mode from the pop-up at the top left of the Layers panel, and you can see I've now blended the two exposures together into a single result, and it's a rather abstract result. And of course, in most cases, an abstract result is exactly what we'll achieve with a multiple exposure composition. I'm going to turn on the next two layers here, one at a time. We'll start with Flowers 2 in this case, and I want to add this image into the mix. So, with this layer visible and active, I'll go ahead and choose the Screen Blend mode from the pop-up on the Layers panel. Now you can see in this case we've certainly blended an additional image, but now things are starting to get a little bit too bright. And that's because the original photos were captured with an exposure that is ideally suited to two images, not three, when blending together to create a multiple exposure effect. So I need to darken up this image just a little bit more. I'll go ahead and add a curves adjustment, and then I will drag the curve downward a bit in order to darken that frame of the image. Of course, I'm actually affecting the entire composition now because the curves adjustment is affecting everything beneath it. But I can add this curves adjustment into a clipping group with the Flowers 2 layer in this case, so that the adjustment will only affect that single adjustment layer. With the curves adjustment layer active, I'll simply choose Layer, Create Clipping Mask, and that image is now in a clipping group with the Flowers 2 layer, so this adjustment only affects that particular layer. So I'll go ahead and refine my adjustment here. That looks about good there. And this should be a reasonably good adjustment for both of the additional images that I want to add into the mix. So I'm going to go ahead and create a copy of my curves adjustment layer by dragging it to the Create New Layer button, the blank sheet of paper icon at the bottom of the Layers panel, and then I'll drag that copy up to the top of the layer stack and add it into a clipping group with my Flowers 1 layer. Again, choosing Layer, Create Clipping Mask from the menu. I'll then turn on my Flowers 1 layer and click on the thumbnail for that layer to make it active, and then choose the Screen Blend mode for that layer as well. And you can see now we've blended 4 images together. And of course, the process is relatively straightforward. All we really need to do in most cases is to bring multiple images together as multiple layers in a single document, and then change the blend mode for all but the bottommost layer to the screen blend mode. But of course, if the original captures were not exposed based on how many images I'm blending together, I'll need to apply some adjustments in order to produce the best result. So for example, in this case, I might want to create another curves copy and attach this one to my flowers 3 layer. I'll go ahead and add that layer into a clipping group with the flowers 3 layer so that we can lighten up each of the layers that we're adding to our bottommost image layer. And you can see that's giving us a very interesting effect within the image. And of course, I can always click on my topmost layer and then add an additional adjustment layer that will affect the entire image if I'd like to. For example, I might want to open up the shadow detail just a little bit or darken that shadow detail. I can apply any adjustment I'd like to these images. Because a multiple exposure image tends to produce a very abstract result, it provides an unlimited range of potential. You can capture images of just about any subject and blend those images together in interesting combinations. The process is not only relatively straightforward, but can also be a great deal of fun as you explore a wide variety of creative possibilities. Quite often, the dynamic range of a scene can exceed the camera's ability to capture the full range of tonal values present. In such cases, you can capture multiple photos at different exposure settings in order to record the full range of tonal values in the scene, and then assemble all of that information into a single image that contains a greater range of detail than would be possible with a single exposure. This is referred to as high dynamic range imaging, or HDR, since it effectively expands the dynamic range potential of your camera. This image shows a typical result you might achieve with a single capture. The clouds in the sky are brightly illuminated, and of course the mountains in the distance are largely in shadow, and so we can't capture all of the detail that's present here. We'll either lose detail in the clouds, losing highlight detail, or we'll lose detail in the mountains, losing shadow detail. By capturing multiple frames, we can overcome this limitation. So here we have an image that was underexposed by one stop in order to retain detail in the clouds, what we might think of as a normal or average exposure, and then an image that was overexposed by one stop in order to capture more detail in the mountains. I'm going to go ahead and click on the first image and then hold the Shift key and click on the last image here in Bridge in order to select all of these images. I'll then choose Tools, Photoshop, Merge to HDR Pro in order to open all 3 of these images and process them to create an HDR result. When I click that option, you'll see that Photoshop processes each of those individual images and assembles them into a single composite using HDR Pro. Once that process is complete, I can fine-tune the settings in HDR Pro in order to produce the best final result. And of course, the best final result is very much a subjective term. I can create something that looks relatively realistic, or I can produce a very artistic interpretation. In this case, I'm just going to produce a relatively straightforward result. The first thing I'll do is change the preset. There are a variety of presets here that allow me to get started with some basic adjustments. For example, if I were to desire a surrealistic effect, which has got large halos and relatively strong contrast, vibrant colors, although in this case there's not much in the way of vibrant colors to work with, you can see this is quite dramatic, and some photographers prefer this approach, at least with certain subjects. But in this case, I'd like to take a different approach. I'm going to produce a photorealistic effect. So I'll choose photorealistic from my preset pop-up. And you can see this produces an image that looks reasonably realistic. We've retained highlight detail in the clouds. We have a pretty good amount of detail in the dark shadows of the mountain. Of course, the image overall looks a little bit flat, so we might want to make some refinements here. The first thing I want to do, though, is to remove ghosts from the image. You'll notice that the water looks rather smooth, but actually there were some relatively strong ripples caused by the wind. But since each capture was captured at a slightly different time, of course, all those ripples are sort of blending together. So if I turn on the Remove Ghosts checkbox, if you watch the water, you'll see that the result is greatly improved. We see more of those ripples because Photoshop is now evaluating each individual frame to try to produce the most realistic result, which blends those ripples together from the best exposure for the ripples. I can then take a look at the various adjustments that affect the appearance of the image. Edge glow is something I would tend to use mostly for more of a creative interpretation, but if I reduce the strength all the way, you can see that with edge glow turned on for this image, we're actually enhancing detail. So it's actually a very good effect. I'll bring that back up a bit, somewhere around there looks to be pretty good. And then we can adjust overall tone and detail. So for example, gamma will allow me to brighten or darken the overall result. Exposure will allow me to adjust the white point in the image. In this case, I might back it off just a hair in order to maximize the detail in the clouds. I would then want to compensate by brightening up the midtones just a little bit. And I can determine how much detail I want to see in the image. You can sort of think of this as a sharpening effect. You'll notice as I increase this value, we can see more and more detail throughout the image. We don't want to go too high. Looks like, right about there seems to work pretty well. And then I can determine how much shadow or highlight detail I want to be able to see. Now, if I maximize the amount of detail, I'm going to tend to produce an image that looks a little bit artificial, a little bit too flat and muddy. So we don't want to take that up too high, just enough to bring out some of those shadow details. And of course, in terms of the highlight adjustment, we don't want to take this up too high or we'll start losing cloud detail. And we don't want to take it too low or we'll start to create a muddy result in those highlights. So finding a value that produces a good degree of contrast. I can also adjust vibrance. Now in this case, the colors in the image are not exactly vibrant to begin with, and so creating too high a vibrance or saturation adjustment here will probably produce a somewhat artificial look to the image. And of course, I can use the curve adjustment to further refine the overall tonality. In this case, I think I'd like to brighten up a portion of the image, mostly focusing on the brighter areas. We don't want to lose highlight detail in the process, of course. I might tone down the highlights, maybe even tone down my exposure just a little bit more, and then continue fine-tuning the overall effect. So somewhere in that range seems to be working pretty well. This is producing an image that looks relatively realistic and yet contains a far greater range of tonal values than I possibly could with a single exposure. I do think I'll tone down the strength of the edge glow just a little bit there, and that's looking pretty good. So I'll go ahead and apply that adjustment, and this will create an image that I can work on further in Photoshop. You'll see that Merge to HDR Pro is assembling the final result. I've set this to a 16-bit mode so that I'll be able to maximize the number of adjustments that are available to me in Photoshop. And of course, that range of possible adjustments is quite extensive. But here we have that basic starting point. We've assembled multiple exposures into a single result using HDR Pro. So now I have a much greater range of tonal values from the original scene compressed into a single result, giving me much more detail than I otherwise could have captured. Creating an HDR image allows you to achieve a result that would be impossible with a single capture, no matter how careful you are about your exposure settings. Whether you're creating a relatively realistic result or a very dramatic and creative interpretation, the key is to capture a full range of tonal values through multiple captures and then assemble those images using one of the many software tools available for this purpose.